Hey, did you know that over 90% of our viewers watch our videos but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these true trucker horror stories, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. It's free and really motivates us to keep the stories rolling. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's stories.
Story number 1. The night had folded itself over the highway like a thick wool blanket, muffling distance and swallowing the world beyond the reach of the truck's headlights. The rig, a weathered blue Peterbilt with a low, steady growl, pushed east along an endless ribbon of asphalt somewhere between way stations and forgotten small towns. Out here, the mile markers felt like suggestions rather than measurements, disappearing into a haze so dense that even the reflective green signs glowed only a few heartbeats before flashing past and falling back into the dark. Dale had driven this stretch more times than he could clearly remember. The route had etched itself into him, the gentle rise and fall of the land under his wheels, the way the horizon usually tinted purple before moonrise, the distant blink of red aviation lights marking unseen towers out in the fields. But tonight the world was different. The fog had come early and with a patience that unnerved him. It didn't roll or drift. It simply existed, thick, pale, and quietly absolute, pressing itself against the windshield like a living thing. The wipers squeaked in a slow, metronomic rhythm, though there was no rain. Condensation collected on the glass and the mirrors, beading and streaking, warping the faint glow of the instrument cluster into watery halos. Inside the cab, the air was stale with the layered scents of old coffee, diesel, and the faint tang of cold metal. A thermos sat in the cup holder, lukewarm by now. The radio murmured low static, punctuated by distant, ghostly strains of a station just beyond reach, the music wavering in and out as though played from another room in another house in another lifetime. Dale flexed his fingers on the steering wheel, feeling the slight tack of worn leather against his skin. The road markings ahead appeared in segments, white dash, wet sheen, white dash, then vanished under the hood. His headlights seemed to shine into a wall of milk. Every so often, the faint shadow of a fence line or a solitary tree materialized just outside the beam, hovered on the edge of understanding, and dissolved back into gray. He checked the digital clock on the dash, 1:27 a.m. He had at least 3 more hours to the next familiar truck stop he trusted, the one with the strong coffee and the waitress who called everyone hun, without sounding like she was forcing it. On normal nights, staying awake was an easy, practiced thing. Tonight, the fog thickened his thoughts, slowing them down. The hum of the engine and the soft vibration under his feet formed a lullaby he remembered from 100 lonely runs, a song of distance and obligation. He blinked hard. The lines on the road shimmered slightly, as if seen through heat. The faint headache behind his eyes pulsed in time with the rotating tires. Here and there, something flickered at the edges of his vision, perhaps the suggestion of taillights far ahead, or the idea of a car in the right-hand mirror. When he checked, there was nothing but his own trailer lights glowing weakly in the mist, red smears in a blank space. The GPS unit stuck to the dash glowed a confident blue. The tiny arrow representing his truck inched along the neat, unwavering line of the interstate. No alternate routes, no upcoming exits for miles, no alerts, just straight ahead. Then, out of the monotony, a sign swam up out of the fog on the right, a tall, rectangular board with reflective white letters. For a blissful second, he thought it might be a distance marker for that familiar truck stop, but as it neared, the words showed something else. Rest area, 2 miles Midway Haven. He frowned. The name landed in his mind like something both new and vaguely remembered, the way a half-forgotten song feels when its first notes play in a grocery store. Midway Haven sounded like the sort of name roadside developers liked, comforting, neutral, almost bland, but it wasn't one he recognized from this stretch. Dale had been taking this interstate for 20 years. The layout of its exits had become a kind of quiet map in his bones. He knew where the good sandwiches were, where the sketchy pumps were, where the rest areas with the dim lights and broken hand dryers could be bypassed. He had never heard of Midway Haven. The fog rushed past the windshield, featureless and constant. He told himself maybe it was new. Highways changed, places closed, others opened. Maybe a developer had bought an old pull-off and dressed it up with a new name. He glanced at the fuel gauge. It hovered just under half. Safe enough, but the weight in his eyelids argued for a break. A quick stop. Coffee. A stretch. The CB crackled faintly on its hook, a soft whisper of static, but no voices cut in. The channel had been mostly quiet all night. Even the highway felt empty. He'd passed only a handful of other trucks in the last hour, brief blurs of light and metal swallowed up behind him. Another sign emerged, a smaller green one this time, low to the ground. Rest area, 1 mile Midway Haven. He slowed a fraction, easing off the accelerator, feeling the subtle shift in the engine's tone. The white dashes on the road grew sharper in his headlight beams as his speed dropped a notch. Somewhere ahead, hidden in the gray, there would be the familiar arc of an off-ramp. The GPS remained indifferent. No exit appeared on the display. The arrow still tracked along one unbroken line of interstate as though nothing lay ahead but more of the same. He frowned deeper, the crease between his brows pulling tight. "That's not right," he murmured to the empty cab, the words dissolving into the hum of tires on damp pavement. But the signs were there. They were small, solid facts in a night that was increasingly uncertain, and fatigue clung to him like a weight. He told himself that satellites glitched, that maps weren't always updated. He'd trusted his own eyes longer than he'd trusted any screen. Then he saw the exit. The off-ramp appeared with no fanfare, a gentle curve peeling away from the right shoulder. The reflective arrows on its sign flickered into view, pointing up and away. The marker read, "Rest Area, Midway Haven" in clear white letters, the font and color regulation perfect, just like every other sanctioned sign he'd ever seen. Without quite realizing he'd made the decision, Dale flicked on his signal and guided the truck onto the ramp. The change in angle was subtle but palpable, the way the weight shifted over the axles as they followed the bend. The fog here seemed denser, hugging the road more closely. The guardrail visible on his right was damp, its metal gleaming faintly like the skin of a submerged creature. The ramp curled gently, then straightened, leading to a wider space where shapes suggested parking areas, small trees, and low buildings. Sodium lamps glowed overhead, their light thickened and blurred by the moisture in the air, casting bronze halos that barely pierced the gray. The surrounding darkness felt less like night and more like an absence, of color, of distance, of anything beyond this small, lit island. Dale rolled the rig into the parking area, following faded white lines painted on blacktop that seemed almost too clean, too free of oil stains and discarded cups. He eased to a stop in a long truck slot, shut the engine down to a purring idle, and felt the hum of the road drop away from under him. Silence rushed in to take its place, but it wasn't true silence. The faint hiss of fog against metal, the soft ticking of the engine cooling, the far-off hum of a vending machine somewhere, the patient whine of fluorescent fixtures. He sat there for a moment in his seat, hands resting loose on his knees, listening to the unfamiliar quiet of Midway Haven. Through the fog-dimmed windshield, he could make out the low shape of the rest area building ahead, a squat structure of pale brick and glass, its windows leaking a soft, welcoming light. Above the entrance, letters glowed faintly in the mist. Midway Haven, welcome TRAVLERS. The sign looked new, or at least well cared for. No flickering bulbs, no missing letters. On the far side of the lot, a row of smaller vehicles, sedans, a minivan, and aging station wagon, sat scattered, their silhouettes softened, each one beaded with moisture. No people moved between them. No one crossed the lot. Yet a few of the vehicles had their interior lights on, faintly illuminating empty cabins. He cut the engine completely. The vibration stilled, leaving his body feeling oddly hollowed out, like a phone whose constant buzz had become normal only to be missed when it stopped. The quiet pressed in. The truck's cab light flicked on as he opened the door, casting the interior in a pale, domestic glow. His thermos, his worn jacket on the passenger seat, the neatly stacked logbooks. Suddenly they all looked like props in a small, private stage set. Beyond the open door, cold, damp air seeped in, smelling faintly of wet concrete and something else he couldn't place. Not rock, not flowers. Something in between, like pages of an old book left in a cool, dry basement. He stepped down onto the asphalt, boots thudding softly. The fog brushed his face in a cool caress. Every sound was strangely close and yet distant at the same time. His footsteps were clear to his ears, but the space around him swallowed their echoes before they could travel. Lights hummed overhead. Somewhere, a bathroom vent fan whirred steadily. Beyond that, nothing. No distant rush of interstate traffic. No low rumbles of other trucks idling. It was as if the ramp he'd taken had led them not just off the highway, but away from it altogether. For an instant, a thin edge of unease slid under his ribs. He glanced back at his rig, its familiar bulk looming quietly behind him, trailer lights a dim red glow in the fog. It was still there, solid, heavy, his anchor. That steadied him. Fatigue did strange things. He had driven long enough to know that miles and lack of sleep could make the world tilt. He zipped his jacket up and headed toward the building. As he walked, the automatic doors whispered open before him with a soft sigh. Warmth, dry and slightly overconditioned, spilled out to meet him, carrying the clean, generic scent of commercial cleaner mixed with old coffee and vending machine snacks. The interior lights were bright but somehow gentle, diffused by frosted panels that turned hard fluorescence into a muted wash. Inside, the layout was textbook rest area. A central hallway with vending machines lined along one side, glowing like little altars of chips and candy. Restrooms down a short corridor. A seating area with bolted-down plastic chairs and molded tables. A bank of pamphlet racks offering maps and local attractions. A wall-mounted television in one corner played a muted program, closed captioned words crawling across the bottom. Only small things were wrong. The vending machines were full, but many of the snack brands he recognized had slightly different logos, as if they belonged to a version of the world that had missed a few decades of marketing changes. The pamphlets in the racks had pictures of towns and roadside curiosities with names he didn't know, despite his years on these interstates. The faces of the people on the covers all seemed turned a little too far away from the camera, leaving their features indistinct, blurred by distance. And there were people, here and there. A man in a gray jacket with a coffee cup sat by the window, looking out into the fog as though watching something only he could see. A woman in a red coat stood near the far wall, reading a bulletin board covered in neatly pinned notices. An older couple moved slowly from pamphlet to pamphlet, whispering to each other in low voices that didn't quite carry. They all shared a similar stillness, a slight slowness to their gestures, as if moving through thicker air than his. Their clothes were unremarkable yet difficult to date, styles that might have been from 10 years ago or 30. Behind a small counter just beyond the vending area, a coffee station had been set up. Large silver urns, stacks of cups, a glass case with prepackaged pastries. Above it, another tidy sign. Complimentary REFRESHMENTS, courtesy of Midway Haven. A middle-aged man with neatly combed hair stood behind the counter, hands folded, watching the room with a calm, patient expression. As Dale approached, the man's gaze drifted to him and settled like a soft weight. "Evening," the man said, his voice pleasant and surprisingly clear in the hushed air. "Long night." Dale nodded, rubbing at the back of his neck. "Feels like it. Didn't even know this place was out here. Is it new?" The man smiled, but the expression didn't quite reach his eyes. It wasn't unfriendly, just slightly reserved. "We've been here a while," he said. "Most people only find us when they need to stop more than they think." Dale didn't entirely understand that, but the complimentarily posted coffee was calling to him. "Smells good," he said, reaching for a cup. "It's always hot," the man replied. "Help yourself. You're welcome to rest as long as you like." The coffee was, against all expectation, excellent. Strong, dark, without the burnt edge so common in late-night stations. It was the kind of coffee that lived in his memory from childhood mornings, when his father's thermos steamed on the kitchen table before a day's work. As Dale sipped, a warmth spread through his chest that was more than temperature. He found a seat near the corner, where he could see both the entrance and his own reflection faintly in the window. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass like a pale, shifting wall. The parking lot lights cast soft circles in it, but nothing moved within those circles. His truck was a suggestion of darker shape. The wall-mounted television a few feet away caught his eye. The sound was off, but the images were crisp. A local news segment from the look of it, an anchor at a desk, then a cut to footage of a highway. For an instant, he saw a blue Peterbilt that looked remarkably like his own, rolling through fog so thick the camera barely caught it. The caption beneath read, "Unexplained disappearance, interstate mystery continues." The date in the corner, if he was reading it correctly, was blurred. One number impossible to make out, the others almost but not quite familiar. He leaned forward, squinting. The shot changed before he could study it further, cutting back to the anchor. Her mouth moved silently, her expression appropriately grave. In the reflection on the TV's glass, he caught the faint outline of his own face, superimposed on hers. For a heartbeat, it looked like he was the one delivering the news. He blinked, sat back, rubbed at his eyes with a knuckle. Fatigue. It had to be fatigue. Screens did strange things when you were this tired. When he glanced around, the other travelers were in much the same positions as when he'd entered, as if only minutes had passed. Yet when he checked the wall clock, an analog thing with a simple white face and black hands, it read 2:13. He looked at his wristwatch, 1:48. The clock on the far wall also read 2:13. So did the one above the restroom hallway. All of them, 2:13, blue second hands unmoving, fatally paused between ticks. The coffee warmed his palms. The quiet deepened. Dale sat there a long moment, feeling as though he were resting in the pocket between one breath and the next. A sense of peace settled over him, the kind of soft, heavy calm he used to feel sitting on his porch at home, back when home was more than a mailbox and a storage unit. The seat was molded plastic, yet it comforted him as if it had been worn into the shape of his body over years. A gentle voice spoke behind him. "Tough run tonight." He turned. A woman stood by the chair opposite his, though he had not heard her approach. Her coat was a muted blue, her hair pulled back. Her face was open, kind in that generic, familiar way some people contained, as if they could stand in for all the small kindnesses the world forgot to offer. She might have been any age between 30 and 50. Her eyes were a dusky, unreadable color. "Fog's strange out there," she added, gesturing vaguely toward the window. "Yeah," he said, clearing his throat. "Never seen it like this on this stretch. Feels like driving through cotton." She smiled slightly. "It's thicker in some places than others," she said. "Sometimes it's worst where you're carrying the most weight." He wondered if she meant the cargo, then realized she wasn't looking at his hands or the grease under his nails, but at his face, as though reading lines that had nothing to do with miles. "Just trying to make my delivery," he said, defaulting to the practical. "Keep on schedule." "Schedules are funny things," she murmured. "They make us think we know how much time we have." He found himself half laughing, shaking his head. "That's some kind of Resteria philosophy." "If you like." Her gaze flicked to the frozen clocks, then back to him. "You look tired." "I am." "Then rest," she said. "That's what we're here for." The we hung in the air, soft and unexplained. He wanted to ask her where here was exactly, how long this place had been in operation, why no one seemed to move very much, why the highway outside sounded so utterly, impossibly distant. But a heaviness was seeping into his limbs, a pleasant density that made the seat feel softer, the air warmer. His coffee cup had emptied itself without him quite registering the sips between full and gone. He wasn't the type to nap in public places. Years on the road had taught him that deep sleep required the familiar enclosure of his cab. Yet his eyelids drooped, and it seemed easier to lean back and let them close for just a minute. The murmuring television, the hum of lights, the subtle, unchanging tick that never quite became a tick from the stopped clocks, all of it wrapped around him like a low, steady tide. Just for a bit, he thought, or perhaps whispered to no one in particular. The chair cradled him. The fog beyond the window turned the world into a blank page. At some point, he must have slept. He opened his eyes to the sensation of having been underwater, rising. The lights were the same. The television still played a muted loop of news and weather. The man behind the coffee counter was refilling one of the urns, his movement unhurried. The woman in the red coat still examined the bulletin board. The couple by the pamphlets continued their quiet perusal. The analog clock still read 2:13. His watch read 4:06. A small jolt of alarm snapped through him, dispelling the last of the drowsiness. He sat up straight. His neck ached faintly from the angle at which he'd slept. He had dreamed something about endless lanes of highway superimposed on each other, like transparent tape, each one carrying a different version of his truck, but the details dissolved as he tried to grasp them. He stood. His legs felt steady. The heaviness had retreated, leaving him oddly refreshed, as though he'd slept longer than a single sitting in a plastic chair should allow. He looked around for the woman in the blue coat, but she was nowhere to be seen. He hadn't heard her leave. At the counter, the attendant glanced up, meeting his eyes with that same unfinished smile. "Get some rest?" he asked. "Yeah," Dale said, voice rough. "How long was I out?" "Long enough," the man replied, as if that were answer enough. Dale glanced once more at the motionless clock hands. A quiet unease stirred, but it yielded to the more immediate concern of his schedule, his delivery window, his logbook entries. Reality reasserted itself in the form of obligations. He set his empty cup on the counter. "Thanks for the coffee," he said. "It's what we're here for," the man answered, the echo of the woman's earlier words soft but unmistakable. "Drive safe out there." The automatic doors parted on his approach, opening onto a world unchanged yet subtly different. The fog was still heavy, still pressed close, but the quality of the darkness had shifted. It felt thinner somehow, as though dawn were considering whether to begin. In the parking lot, his truck waited exactly where he'd left it, patient, unremarkable. The smaller vehicles were in the same positions. A light glowed inside the old station wagon now, outlining an empty baby seat in the back. No figures walked between the cars. No other engines idled. He climbed into his cab, shut the door behind him with a solid thud that returned a welcome intimacy to his space. The hum of the cabin seemed louder now, the smell of his own thermos and worn upholstery somehow more distinct after the clean antiseptic of Midway Haven. He turned the key. The engine rumbled to life, a familiar grounding sound. The dashboard lit up. The digital clock blinked 4:08. His GPS flickered awake, its map recentering on his location. There was no side road indicated, no rest area icon. His position cursor hovered directly on the interstate, as if he had never left it. He stared at the display, zoomed in, then out. The blue line of the highway arced across the screen, pristine and undisturbed. No exits appeared within the last 10 miles. Ahead, the next marked rest stop was still the one he recognized, hours away. A slow chill slid down his spine, not icy, but cool like fog creeping under a door. He shifted into gear, eased the truck forward. The access road leading back to the interstate appeared in his headlights, ordinary and serviceable. He followed it, feeling the subtle rise and merge. As the truck's nose swung back onto the highway, he glanced in the side mirror, more out of habit than curiosity. The reflection showed gray nothing, his trailer lights and the waking line of road behind him. Where Midway Haven should have been, a low-lit building, a modest parking lot, a warmly glowing sign, there was only a wall of fog. He watched, waiting for some hint of light to emerge, some shape to attest to where he'd just been. The mirror offered only his own receding brake lights and the soft, endless gray. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. The interstate unfolded ahead, its white lines drawing him forward. The GPS was satisfied. The engine's rumble steadied into a familiar rhythm. In the distance, faint and slowly gaining strength, the first subtle paling of the sky suggested that morning somewhere was beginning. He could have pulled over onto the shoulder. He could have stopped, stepped down, tried to find the ramp again on foot, as if a few paces would prove or disprove the reality of the last few hours. Instead, he drove, because driving was what he had always done when the world made less sense than he wanted it to. The CB crackled on its hook, a burst of static resolving into a voice. A man, somewhere up ahead or behind, speaking in the easy shorthand of night drivers. "You see that fog back there," the voice said. "Thought I'd never get through. Had to keep my eyes on the lines the whole way. Felt like it was trying to pull me off the road." Another voice cut in, a chuckle. "You been out too long, man. No fog on this stretch tonight. Clear as glass for the last 100 miles. Dale listened, mouth dry. He reached for his own CB, thumbed the talk button, then thought better of it and set it back down. The words felt stuck, half-formed, like a dream he couldn't quite translate. On the passenger seat, his logbook lay open where he'd left it. The last entry was at 1:30 a.m., just before the first sign for Midway Haven. He picked up his pen at a long red light hours later, intending to fill in the gap. For a moment, the pen hovered. Rest break 1:30 a.m. to 4:00 a.m. He hesitated, then wrote it anyway. He couldn't prove those hours any more or less than any other part of his run. And yet, thinking of the frozen clocks and the identical 2:13s, he knew time had not passed there in the ordinary way. As the sky slowly lightened to a washed-out blue, the fog thinned and finally peeled away, revealing ordinary fields, ordinary overpasses, ordinary signs. The miles slid beneath his tires in their usual quiet procession, carrying him toward his delivery, his next stop, the next night. Long afterward, when other drivers mentioned strange stretches of road or exits that didn't line up with their maps, he found his thoughts drifting back to that building in the mist, the coffee that tasted like memory, the woman who told him to rest, the clocks that refused to move. He never found Midway Haven on any printed map or digital database. No one he talked to had heard of such a place on that interstate. Yet sometimes, on nights when the fog lay heavy and the world shrank again to the reach of his headlights, he would see a glimmer up ahead, a faint suggestion of an exit where none should be. He never took it again, but as he drove past, a part of him always wondered if the sign was still there, bright and confident in the mist. Rest area Midway Haven, welcome TRAVLERS. Waiting for those who needed to stop more than they knew. Story number 2. The mountains rose and fell around the highway like the slow breath of something massive and sleeping, their dark shoulders crowding the 2-lane blacktop into a narrow, twisting path. Above, the sky was a blank and starless dome, the moon a pale smear behind cloud. Below, in the low places between ridges, the world had filled with fog, a dense, pearly sea that swallowed valleys whole and lapped at the edges of the road. Leela guided her refrigerated rig along Route 73 with the careful steadiness of someone used to balancing weight and weather. The trailer hummed faintly behind her, its cooling unit cycling on and off with a soft, mechanical sigh. Inside the cab, the air smelled of diesel, coffee, and the faint citrus of a dash-mounted air freshener that had long since faded to suggestion. The dashboard glowed a subdued constellation of amber and green, gauges, dials, the pale digital readout of the clock. 12:41 a.m. She had 3 hours to go before the small distribution center on the other side of the mountains. Under normal conditions, the run would be straightforward. But tonight, the fog had come early and in layers, hanging low in the hollows, pooling on the asphalt in thick patches that turned the road ahead into short, uncertain corridors. Her headlights carved a tunnel through the whiteness. Beyond that narrow beam, the world seemed to end. The tires hummed over the pavement, occasionally hissing through invisible moisture. Reflective posts along the shoulder appeared in sequence like patient sentries, each one materializing from the glow, catching the light in a brief, bright wink, then fading behind her into darkness. Guardrails gleamed dull silver when the road flirted with a drop. Here and there, the silhouettes of pines leaned in from the slopes, their tops swallowed by cloud. The CB radio on the dash lay still, its display a quiet green rectangle. She had heard only a handful of voices all night, a quick exchange about a blown tire an hour back, a brief complaint about coffee at a gas station she'd passed. Now the channels simmered with low, distant static, the kind that suggested voices might be just beyond reach, like conversations heard through a wall. To keep herself company, she turned the knob on the regular radio, scanning past hiss and snippets of song. Commercial stations came and went, their signals too weak in these hills. Country music dissolved into fuzz. A talk show host turned into an underwater murmur. Somewhere a hymn rose briefly and dropped again into the mist. Then a clear note cut through, the warble of an old steel guitar, rich and full as if from another decade. Leela paused her search and nudged the tuning knob back the tiniest fraction. The music swelled into focus, warm and analog, unhurried. The song was unfamiliar, but its bones were the shape of every road song she'd ever heard. Lonely highways, far-off towns, headlights in the rain. The track faded and a voice came on. Male, medium-aged, with a mellow timbre and a hint of the mountains in its vowels. Good evening, drivers and night travelers. You're tuned to High Ridge Truckers Network, keeping you company between the white lines. If you're out on 73 tonight, eyes up and hands steady. Fog advisory from mile marker 212 through 219. That's a real pea soup, so take it slow. Leela's fingers tightened slightly on the wheel. Her last marker had been 211. For a moment, she wondered if she'd stumbled onto a local station she'd never heard before. The larger companies had apps now, polished and network branded, but this sounded like something older, smaller, homier. A voice from a station that might be tucked into a hillside somewhere, its antenna reaching only as far as the ridges allowed. Remember, the host went on, his tone conversational as if he could see her nodding, no load is worth more than you are. If you're feeling the weight in your eyelids, there's a way station common up at mile 215. High Ridge Check, it's called. Good place to sit a spell, let the fog think about lifting. She frowned slightly. She'd been over this route enough in the past year to know the landmarks. There was an overlook somewhere near 217, a truck pull-off at 220, but no way station she could recall. Maybe it was new, or maybe she had simply never needed to stop there before and had filtered it out with all the other roadside noise. Still, something about the way he said it, High Ridge Check, like an old friend's name, lodged in her mind. The road slipped downward into a shallow curve, and the fog thickened as she entered the low point between two unseen waves of land. Visibility shrank to a breath, then half a breath. The white centerline became her lifeline, its paint catching the light and flaring briefly before dissolving under her hood. The radio host let a moment of silence stretch before speaking again. Now, for those of you drinking from a blue thermos with a chipped handle, maybe take that next sip a little slower. You're counting on it a bit too much tonight. Leela's heart gave a small, unwelcome jump. On the dashboard shelf within arm's reach, her own thermos sat exactly as described. Blue enamel, handle chipped from an impact somewhere between a warehouse and a rest stop 3 weeks ago. It was something no one on the far end of an anonymous signal could possibly see. The fog pressed closer, as if reacting to her sudden stillness. She glanced around the cab as though expecting to find a camera tucked into the headliner, then dismissed the thought. Paranoia in the dark made fools of sensible people. The voice was coincidence. Blue thermoses were common in this line of work, chipped ones even more so. She lifted the thermos, its familiar weight solid in her hand, and took a measured sip. The coffee inside had cooled to a lukewarm bitterness, but the act of drinking provided at least the illusion of control. "Mile marker 212 just slid by your window," the host said lightly, the music bed beneath his words barely there. "You won't see it again, not in this fog. Trust me on that. But you know it's there, like a promise." Leela's gaze snapped to the right shoulder. The last marker she'd glimpsed had indeed been 212, a green rectangle blurring up from the mist. She hadn't paid attention to when it appeared because she'd been listening to him. Now, belatedly, the sequence of events clicked together in her mind. Her hands tightened again on the wheel. "How do you?" Her own voice sounded small in the confines of the cab. The radio didn't answer her question. The host simply rolled into a quiet weather report, naming towns she vaguely recognized and others she'd never heard of. Scattered showers, low visibility, a reminder that up here at elevation, conditions changed fast. She could have turned the radio off. The thought floated through her mind like a dry leaf. She could have twisted the knob, returned the cab to engine noise and CB static. But the fog outside had compressed her world into such a small, lonely bubble that the idea of shutting out the only intelligible voice felt worse than enduring its uncanny familiarity. So she drove on. The road swung left around an invisible shoulder of rock, then straightened. Her headlights briefly caught the pale trunks of birches, their bark ghostly against the dark undergrowth. The guardrail on her right gave way to a low stone wall, then to nothing, the air beyond it dropping into a white, depthless nothing that might have been 10 feet of slope or 1,000. Mile marker 213 appeared. Its numbers shone back at her, steady and reassuring. She exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "See," the host said mildly, still moving forward. The next few minutes unspooled in a slow, tense sameness. Trees, fog, guardrails, the intimate space of her cabin. The hum of tires on damp road became a mantra. Every now and then, she would catch the suggestion of motion in the mirrors, a phantom of headlights behind her, but when she checked, the glass reflected only the ghost glow of her own trailer lights diffused in the mist. Then she saw it, a green overhead sign emerging from the whiteness, letters reflecting dull in her beams. "Way station 1 mile." She blinked, slowed a touch. The sign's smaller print was swallowed by the fog before she could read it, but the main message was unmistakable. She had not imagined the host's mention. There was, in fact, a way station up here. The GPS display on her dash told a different story. The neat digital line representing Route 73 showed no icons or turnoffs for the next several miles. Just the road, a simple white snake across dark terrain, innocent of any mention of high ridge check. "GPS must be out of date," she muttered to herself, though she'd updated the software a month ago. "Technology forgets places sometimes," the radio host observed, as if responding to a thought instead of a spoken word. "But the road remembers them. The road remembers everything." She lifted her foot from the accelerator a fraction more, the truck's speed easing back. The engine's pitch dropped, deepening into a more resonant hum. Ahead, the suggestion of an exit sign teased the edge of visibility. "Way station, high ridge check. All trucks must stop." The arrow pointed to the right, up a gentle ramp vanishing into white. Her instincts, the ones honed on rest stops, inspection points, surprise checks, whispered authority at the phrase "must stop." But alongside them, Another voice, more primal, suggested that leaving the known ribbon of the highway for a ramp that seemed to lead into a void might be unwise. Leela kept her wheels straight. As she passed the ramp, she turned her head for a better look. For a moment, the ghost of a small building loomed through the fog, a low rectangle, its roofline barely visible, a single pole-mounted sodium light spilling a modest circle of gold onto wet pavement. Then it was gone, swallowed behind her as if drawn into the rear view. "Suit yourself," the host said, not unkindly. "Some folks like to push on through." She swallowed, feeling the motion of her throat as a conscious act. The steering wheel felt different under her palms now, less like a familiar tool and more like the only thing tethering her to a reality that was loosening around the edges. She checked the clock. 12:59 a.m. It felt later than that. A fresh layer of fog slid down from the dark slopes, thickening the air until the high beams were almost useless, blooming off the whiteness and blinding. She clicked them back to low, trusting the closer, narrower field of view. Minutes, maybe more, maybe less, drifted past in the same soft, colorless suspension. Leela's attention narrowed to the painted centerline, the occasional roadside reflector, the rhythm of the host's voice. And for those of you passing by that high ridge sign, just remember, there's such a thing as driven past your own exit. Happens more often than we admit. She didn't notice the billboard until she was almost under it. It rose out of the fog on the left, tall and rectangular, its support poles anchored in invisible ground. In her headlights, she caught a glimpse of an image. A steaming mug of coffee, a plate of pie, the warm glow of interior lights seen through a diner window. "Welcome, drivers, High Ridge Diner, exit 214. Her eyes flicked to the GPS. No exits showed at 214. The fog behind the billboard seemed thicker, denser. She drove on. After a while, long enough for her sense of time to untether completely from the digits on the dash, she saw a shape at the roadside that led her breath to hitch. The dark curve of something lying partially in the shoulder, right where the fog pooled deepest. A deer, she realized an instant later, already bracing. It lay stretched on its side, legs stiff, its body a darker smudge against the pale haze. As she passed, her headlights picked out the reflective tape of an old orange construction barrel tipped on its side just beyond the animal, the two shapes forming a little tableau of neglect. Half a mile later, the radio host chuckled softly. "Some folks swear the same things will be waiting for you on a road like this, no matter how many miles you put under you. Same signs, same critters, little loops in the world. Ever get that feeling?" Leela did not answer. The chill that walked down her arms was answer enough. The next green sign emerged from the fog, its paint slick with moisture. "Way station 1 mile. Her breath went shallow. The second time she passed the high ridge check exit, she watched more carefully. The building and its solitary light appeared exactly as before. The road around her felt identical, the same gentle rightward sweep, the same stand of invisible trees crouching just beyond the upward ramp. The radio said nothing this time. The host let the hum of a low fiddle fill the space instead. Her hands tightened on the wheel until the leather pressed hard into her palms. A familiar, quiet panic tried to uncurl in her chest, not the sharp spike of immediate danger, but the slow, sinking awareness that something had slipped sideways out of the expected. She kept driving. The billboard for High Ridge Diner came again. Same steaming mug, same plate of pie, same lettering. She could have sworn the coffee's painted steam curled differently this time, but she told herself that was memory and movement playing tricks, memory and fog. The deer, when she saw it again, lay in the exact same angle, the same tipped orange barrel beyond it, as if preserved between passes. Her heart hammered now, each beat loud enough to feel in her throat. She forced her voice steady. "Okay," she said aloud to the dashboard, the fog, the host in the unseen booth. "I get it. You've made your point." The radio crackled softly, a sound like someone leaning too close to a microphone. Then the host spoke, his tone gentler than before. "Some stretches of road, they do like it when you ignore the signs." A pause, the low fiddle swelled, then dropped away entirely. "You're running on fumes, Leela. Not in your tanks. Don't go looking at the gauge. I know it's fine. In here." A beat. "Behind your eyes, you passed tired an hour ago. Maybe two. Hard to tell out here between places." The use of her name made the cab feel smaller, as though the walls had leaned in a fraction. Her fingers twitched toward the ignition key, the irrational urge to cut the power to everything, including the impossible voice. But the dark beyond her headlight tunnel pressed back hard at that thought. Alone, silent, sensorless in this fog. No. She swallowed, throat dry. "What happens if I keep going?" she asked, softer. "You keep going," the host replied, "till the road folds you back on yourself so many times you can't tell yesterday from tomorrow. You look up one day and wonder how you got so old, and how the mountains got so familiar you stopped seeing them at all." The CB radio crackled suddenly on the dash, a sharp burst that made her jump. A voice, distorted by distance and interference, bled through. "Anyone else catching that old trucker station? Hi something. High noise tonight. Swear I passed the same mile marker 3 times." The transmission dissolved back into static. Leela's chest eased a fraction. She was not the only one. It wasn't solely her imagination unraveling at the seams. Others heard it. Others felt the loop. Ahead, the way station 1 mile sign loomed again. Impossibly, implausibly. She braked a little harder this time, feeling the gentle lurch of the trailer's weight respond. The truck's speed bled off, the engine's hum dropping to a purr. The arrow for High Ridge check shone pale and patient. "Your call," the host said quietly. "Always your call, but not every road gives you the chance to get off when you need to." She flipped on her right indicator. The soft tick-tick of the blinker seemed startlingly loud in the cabin. The ramp curved upward and away, its guardrail slick with moisture. As her tires left the main line and committed to the incline, the fog seemed to thin by a subtle but definite degree, as if some unseen boundary had been crossed. The way station unfolded slowly from the whiteness. A wide, flat apron of pavement, painted lines crisp and nearly free of tire scars. A low brick building with a glass front, its interior lights a muted honeyed glow. The scale itself sat embedded in the concrete, its metal plates darkened by damp, its digital display a blank, shining black. A single pole-mounted lamp cast a circle of warm light over the forecourt. Beyond that circle, the world blurred into soft, featureless gray. "Welcome to High Ridge Check," the host said, his voice warmer now, almost proud. "Go on and roll over the plates if you like, or just park a spell. Nobody's in a hurry here." She eased the truck across the scale, watching the imaginary numbers climb in her mind, though none appeared on the blank readout. Then she pulled forward into a marked spot and set the brake. The engine's idle shuddered gently through the cab. Silence wrapped around the truck, but it was a different kind of silence than on the open road. It felt held, contained by the small geography of the station. The fog pressed against the lit area with less insistence, as if content to watch. Inside the building, shadows moved faintly behind the glass. No shape she could make out, only the suggestion of depth. For a long moment, Leela remained in her seat, hands resting on her knees, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the low, insistent thrum of her own pulse. The radio continued to emit a barely audible bed of ambient sound. No music now, just the soft noise of a room somewhere. A chair creaking, papers shifting, the almost imperceptible buzz of fluorescent tubes. Finally, the tension in her shoulders made itself known as a dull ache. It was the kind of ache that no amount of coffee could mend. She unbuckled her belt, grabbed her jacket from the back of the seat, and opened the door. Cold, damp air touched her face like the hand of a cautious acquaintance. She climbed down, boots thudding softly on the wet concrete, and walked toward the building. Each step seemed slightly muffled, as though the fog underfoot cushioned the sound. The glass door yielded to her touch with a gentle, well-oiled swing. Warmth and the faint scent of coffee grounds greeted her. Inside, High Ridge Check could have been any way station from the late 1970s. Wood-paneled walls, scuffed linoleum floor, a long counter with a raised section for paperwork. A coffee pot sat on a side table, half full, its surface dark and still. A corkboard behind the counter held faded notices about axle limits and inspection hours, their edges curling. No one stood behind the counter. No one occupied the two vinyl chairs along the wall, yet the space did not feel truly empty. It felt, recently vacated, as though someone had just stepped into a back room and might return at any moment. On the far wall, a round clock hung slightly crooked. Its hands were set to 1:17. The second hand did not move. Leela stepped closer to the counter. On its surface lay a heavy, old-fashioned microphone attached to a console of dials and switches. Beside it, a small beige radio transmitter unit hummed faintly, its single red power light steady. "Nice to finally have you stop in," the familiar voice said. This time, it came not from the speaker in her cab, but from a small ceiling-mounted one in the far corner of the room. The sound was fuller here, more immediate. "You look taller than you sound." She turned, half expecting to find the host sitting on one of the vinyl chairs, a mug in his hand, that old steel guitar propped in the corner. There was no one. "You're not really here," she said carefully, feeling a little foolish for addressing an empty room. Her breath came out in a faint puff in the cooler interior air. "Depends what you mean by here," the voice replied, with the easy humor of someone well-practiced in dodging the obvious. "Been keeping an ear on this stretch a long time, long enough to know when someone's running on borrowed alertness." She scanned the room again. On the counter, a ledger lay open. The names written in its columns marched down the page in various hands and inks, some faded, some fresh. She saw Rick T. 0210, Mara G. 0303, R. Shorty H. 1201. Near the bottom, her own name had been entered in neat block letters, LILAC 117. Next to it, under weight, someone had written heavy and underlined it. Her mouth quirked despite the unease. "Q." "We've all been there," the voice said. "One more run, one more hour, one more cup from that chipped blue thermos. Eyes burning, hands a little slow on the wheel. You're not the first to loop this ridge more times than you meant to." She curled her fingers against the edge of the counter, feeling the worn wood bite gently into her skin. "What is this place?" she asked. "A place between," the host said. "Built when they put this road in, more or less. Official once upon a time. Scales and inspections, tickets and warnings. Then somebody higher up decided they didn't need it anymore. They shut it down, turned off the lights, stopped marking it on the new maps." He paused, a subtle shift in his breathing, the only indication he was still on the line. "But the mountain didn't get the memo. The road still runs past. The fog still rolls in. Drivers still get more tired than they should be. So High Ridge Check kept on, in its way." Leela let the words settle. The quietly humming equipment, the ledger with its layers of names. The way the fog had folded the road into a repeating pattern until she yielded to the off-ramp. "How long have I been driving in circles out there?" she asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted the answer. "In miles or in years," the host countered softly. "Clock on the wall says 1:17. Your dash says something else, I'm guessing. Truth's probably somewhere in the middle. Doesn't much matter. You're here now, that's what counts." She glanced at the clock, still 1:17, still perfectly unmoved. Her wristwatch read 2:58. The digits on her mental logbook, the planned arrival times and schedules, felt suddenly abstract. Numbers applied to a world that operated at a different pace from this little room in the fog. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, and realized as she said it that some part of her had already accepted this place as having the right to ask for something. "Sit," the host said simply. "That's all. There's a chair right behind you. Been waiting for you longer than you know." She turned. One of the vinyl seats stood at a slight angle from the wall, its plastic surface uncracked but soft-looking, the cushion gently indented as if recently occupied. Beside it, a small side table held a lone, chipped mug and a folded blanket. The exhaustion she had been holding at bay with caffeine and stubbornness seeped up from the soles of her feet, through her legs, into her spine. It was not the sharp, dangerous fatigue of nodding at the wheel. It was deeper, older, the tiredness of years of early mornings and restless layovers, of short calls home and long stretches of road humming beneath her. She sat. The chair accepted her with a sigh of springs and a familiar creak. The vinyl was cool through her jacket, then warmed quickly. In the corner, the speaker hummed softly with room tone. On the counter, the little red power light on the transmitter blinked once, then steadied. "We'll keep an eye on the road for you," the host said quietly. "You just rest. When the fog had its say and lifted a bit, you'll know. Doors'll still open. Truck'll still run. Load'll still be where you left it. World won't have gone anywhere it wasn't already heading." Her eyelids felt heavy, but the heaviness was comforting, like a weighted blanket pulled up to her chin. She let her head rest against the high back of the chair. The ticking absence of the unmoving clock filled the space where a true tick-tick might have been. "Do people ever not leave?" she murmured, words blurring at the edges. "Some stop longer than others," the host admitted. "Some come back more than once, but even up here time keeps a loose kind of count. Roads keep calling. Sooner or later, everybody rolls on." Her breathing slowed. Somewhere deep in the fog outside, a truck passed on the unseen highway, its distant rumble a low, comforting sound. The chair beneath her seemed to cradle her in its worn embrace. As she surrendered to sleep, the last thing she heard was the host's voice, softer than before, as if speaking not into a microphone but into the room itself. "Rest well, Leela. We've got the watch." She dreamed of roads without end, yes, but not the tight, claustrophobic loop she'd driven through the fog. These roads sprawled under wide, clear skies, their lines straight and true, their miles neither rushing nor dragging. At every junction there was a small, well-lit station, and in each one a familiar voice said, "You're okay. Take your time." When she woke, she did so all at once, like surfacing. The room looked the same and subtly different. The light through the front glass was cooler, edged with the faintest hint of gray-blue that suggested the idea of dawn somewhere beyond the fog. The coffee pot on the side table was empty now, its hot plate silent. The clock on the wall still read 1:17. Her wristwatch said 5:12. She rose, stiffness peeling away from her joints in layers. The vinyl chair released its hold with a soft sigh. The building felt emptier now, as if the presence she'd sensed before had withdrawn a pace or two, giving her space. "Hello," she said, half expecting the host's voice to answer. Silence met her. The ceiling speaker emitted only a faint, inactive hum. The small transmitter on the counter had gone dark, its red light extinguished. On the ledger, her name remained, ink dried, its letters no more or less remarkable than the others above and below. As she watched, a tiny drop of moisture from somewhere overhead fell onto the page, blurring the underlined word heavy into a small gray cloud. Leela smiled a little. "Fair enough," she said softly. She stepped outside. The fog had thinned, no longer a solid wall but a gauzy curtain. Through it, she could see hints of distant treetops, the suggestion of the highway's faint rise and fall beyond the access road. The air carried a trace of pine and damp earth. Her truck waited on the apron, paint beaded with fine droplets. The scale sat quiet beneath it. She climbed into the cab, the familiar act of settling into her seat, buckling the belt, turning the key, all unfolding with a comforting, ritual precision. The engine turned over, caught, and settled into its steady rumble. The dashboard came alive. The GPS display blinked, found itself, and traced the white line of Route 73. There, a tiny icon now marked a side road where before there had been only unbroken highway, a small, unlabeled spur branching off and looping back. No rest area symbol, no way station tag, just a gray suggestion of pavement. As she pulled out, she glanced back at the building. From this angle and in this thinner light, High Ridge Check looked older. Its paint was more weathered, its roofline sagging slightly. One of the front windows was cracked, a spiderweb of lines radiating from an old impact. The pole-mounted lamp was off. The sign above the door, High Ridge Checkway Station, had a nest of dead leaves caught in one corner. It looked, she thought, very much like a place long since abandoned. Yet as she merged back onto the highway and the building slid out of view, the radio flickered back to life for a moment. A single bar of steel guitar, clear and warm like a greeting. Then the familiar voice, distant, almost lost in static. "Safe travels, Leela. We'll be here if the fog ever turns you around again." The signal faded into ordinary mountain radio noise. When she scanned the stations, there was no trace of High Ridge Truckers Network. Only modern pop, talk shows, weather reports. The CB carried the usual morning chorus of check-ins and jokes as other drivers began their days. Mile marker 216 appeared ahead, dull green in the mist. She passed it once, and only once. The billboard for High Ridge Diner never showed itself again. The road unwound in front of her like a narrow, honest path through slowly lifting clouds. Hours later, when she rolled into the distribution center's yard, the sky was fully awake, the fog burned off, the mountains revealed in their solid, ordinary majesty. She logged her arrival, apologized for the slight delay, accepted it when the clerk waved it off with a shrug. Trucks were late sometimes. Weather happened. Schedules flexed. But in the small hours of other nights, when she found herself alone on some isolated grade, lights of civilization miles behind and miles ahead, and the fog began to gather at the edges of her beams, a part of her listened for a certain mellow voice between stations. Sometimes, when her thermos was nearly empty and the ache behind her eyes sharpened, she would think about that unmoving clock and the ledger full of names, about the strange kindness of a place that existed somewhere between shut down and open, forgotten and needed. And though she never again found High Ridge Check on a map or a screen, she knew, in the quiet way one knows the shape of a familiar curve, that somewhere in the high places of the world, there was a modest building with warm lights, watching the fog and waiting for those who had been looping too long. Story number 3. The causeway rose out of the marsh like a strip of asphalt laid across a drowned world, its concrete piers sunk into black water and tangled reeds. On clear days, the view from the cab could stretch for miles on either side, flat, silver shallows feeding into the broader mouth of the bay, flocks of pale birds wheeling above the tidal flats. But tonight, the world had shrunk to the width of the lane and the length of a pair of headlights. Fog clung to Greywater Causeway as if it had always belonged there. It did not move much, not the dramatic, cinematic rolling of clouds. Instead, it hung in place, dense and damp, turning the air into something that wasn't quite liquid and wasn't quite solid. Moisture beaded on the side mirrors of Ronan's truck, tracing slow, fat lines downward. The wipers whispered across the windshield at regular intervals, pushing away a sheen of condensation that reappeared almost as quickly as it was cleared. Inside the cab, everything felt closer. The dashboard's muted glow painted Ronan's hands in faint green as they rested on the wheel. The engine hummed under his boots with a deep, steady vibration. His thermos, set in the cup holder, rattled softly with each minor imperfection in the road. The faint smell of strong coffee, old upholstery, and warm plastic formed a small, familiar atmosphere around him, a tiny, portable room moving through an immeasurable dark. A blue lead clock in the dash read 1:09 a.m. The GPS beside it traced a pale line for Route 11, an almost perfectly straight stripe across the stylized map of marsh and water. Ahead, tiny icons for the far shore and the junction with another highway sat a fixed distance away. The kind of distance that should have taken 20 minutes, maybe 30, under normal conditions. These were not normal conditions. Ronan leaned forward a little, scanning the fog beyond the hood. The low beam of his headlights tunneled through the whiteness for perhaps 50 yards before dissolving into a featureless, glowing gray. The reflective paint of the lane lines shone back at him in broken segments, bright and bright, a pulse that seemed to keep time with his heartbeat. On the right, the guardrail appeared in fragments, a metal ribbon emerging, then slipping away, its posts slick with moisture. He knew the water was out there, just beyond sight. Brackish, cold, quietly lapping against concrete. It made the sense of isolation stranger, this feeling of being suspended above something so wide and open, and yet unable to see more than a short hallway of road ahead. The CB sat on its bracket, speaker dormant. The main radio, tuned low, muttered a thread of soft rock that broke up occasionally into static. Signals did odd things out here with the fog and the flat expanse of water. Stations seemed to bounce and scatter, sometimes vanishing altogether as if swallowed by the marsh. He had been on duty for just under 9 hours, within his legal window but close enough that the weight of the day pressed into the muscles at the back of his neck. The load behind him, a trailer full of packaged frozen goods bound for a warehouse near the city, rode smoothly, weight balanced, nothing shifting. It was a routine run. There was comfort in that. Still, as the truck rolled deeper into the fog-bound stretch of causeway, a thin, almost imperceptible thread of unease wound through his thoughts. It wasn't fear, not exactly. More like that peculiar, small alertness that animals showed before weather changed, when the air thickened and sound behaved strangely. He checked his mirrors out of habit. The left one showed the faint curve of the lane line sliding past the trailer. The right reflected the dull gleam of the guardrail and white beyond. No other headlights, no other vehicles. His hand drifted to the CB mic. A little chatter from other drivers might have been a comfort. He held it for a second, thumb resting near the talk button, then let it go. The fog made him oddly reluctant to break the quiet, as if words might go nowhere, absorbed into this soft, white emptiness. After a while, he could not have said how long, the glow of something appeared far behind him. In the right mirror at first, a faint smear of brightness in the distance, like some distant town's reflection on clouds. Then, gradually, it resolved into a more defined shape, a pair of headlights, blurred by the fog but distinct, set at the wideness of a large vehicle. Ronan felt a flicker of relief. Another truck, then. Someone else working the graveyard hours over Greywater. The presence of another rig, even unseen, made the world feel less thin. He noted the distance behind him, not far, not close. The other driver was doing exactly what he was, moving carefully, maintaining a safe space. The luminous eyes in his mirror swayed slightly with the subtle curves of the causeway, always following, steady, unhurried. Minutes crawled by. The headlights behind neither gained nor fell back. He adjusted his own speed, dropping a few miles per hour, and watched. The lights matched him, keeping the same distance. He nudged the accelerator, engine note rising a little. The numbers on the dash climbed. So did the pace of the reflection behind. The glowing orbs remained planted in the same tiny section of mirror, like they had been painted there. A small crease formed between his brows. There was nothing aggressively unnatural in the behavior. After all, a conscientious driver might well choose to maintain a consistent following distance. But there was something about the exactness of it, how perfectly the distance held, no matter how gently he altered his speed, that sanded at his nerves. "All right, friend," he said under his breath, more to fill the air than to be heard. "Either pass or hang back, but don't play games." The other truck continued as before, quiet, patient. He lifted the CB mic and thumbed the button. "Breaker 19, this is northbound on Greywater. You ridden my bumper back there." The speaker hissed softly, carrying his own voice out into the silent marsh. Only static replied. No drawl, no dry joke, no answering call sign. He cleared his throat, tried again. Northbound on 11, Greywater Causeway. Got a set of lights back there that seem glued in place. If that's you, friend, give a shout. Silence again, broken only by a faint ripple of interference, as though someone had almost spoken into a wind. He set the mic back in its cradle, senses sharpened. The radio's soft rock station faded out entirely for a moment, replaced by a low, thrumming hiss, then snapped back in with a chorus as if nothing had interrupted. Ronan tried to shrug it off. Radios glitched. Fog messed with signals. The other driver might have his CB turned off, content to ride in his own bubble of noise and thought. Not everyone felt the need to talk their way through the night. The fog around the truck thickened, if that were possible, turning from a bright, permeable gray to something denser, a luminous cotton wool. The lane lines became ghosts at the limits of vision. Overhead, the faint shadow of a power line truss appeared briefly, one of the tall steel frames that marched along the causeway at intervals, then vanished like something seen behind frosted glass. He checked the GPS. The tiny arrow representing his rig inched along the digital causeway, but the distance to the far shore had not changed as much as it should have. A glitch. Maybe the unit was struggling with signal across the flat water. He tapped the screen once with a knuckle. Nothing new. In the mirror, the headlights behind remained. Not closer, not farther, just there. The fog distorted their shape occasionally, drawing little halos around them, dimming and brightening in tiny pulses. Once or twice, for the briefest instant, he thought he saw more, an outline of grillwork, the suggestion of a tall, squared-off cab. Then the whiteness swallowed the details again. A thin voice slid into the cab, quiet and grainy, as if sneaking in under the edge of the door rather than through the speakers. Northbound on Greywater, watch your right shoulder 2 miles ahead. It was a man's voice, mid-range, a little rough. Not quite old, not quite young. There was a slow, careful cadence to it, like someone choosing words from an older vocabulary. It came through the CB with a faint, metallic echo. Ronan's hand flew to the mic. "That you behind me?" he asked, pulse quickening. A pause, the kind in which 100 thoughts can bloom and close. "You're running the white reefer with the silver stripe," the voice said. Company name in blue on the door, left headlight a little duller than the right. He glanced at his side mirror out of reflex, as if he could see his own front end from here. The description pinned him as accurately as a line on a manifest. "Yeah," he said slowly, "that be me, and you are." "Call me Lantern," the voice replied, a hint of something like humor in it. "Most do when they hear me at all." He didn't recognize the handle. He'd been running these routes long enough to know most of the regulars, at least by their radio names. Lantern was new. "Appreciate the tip, Lantern," he said. "What's on my right shoulder 2 miles up?" "You'll see it," Lantern answered. "Just keep your lane. Don't drift for a better look. Fog likes to bend things wrong on this stretch." Something in the tone, calm, unhurried, with no hint of melodrama, settled in his bones more surely than a panicked warning would have. It sounded like a man who had said such things many times and seen them play out. The odometer whispered on. The white of the world did not change much. Music on the radio slid into a ballad and back out to commercial. In the mirror, the twin lights hung steadfast. Then, ahead and to the right, the fog drew back a fraction to reveal a darker lump at the edge of the shoulder. As the truck closed the distance, its shape coalesced. A small sedan, nose angled toward the guardrail, hazard lights clicking a weak amber against the gray. No one stood beside it. Its tires sat just on the painted edge line, close enough that a driver straying within his lane by even a foot could have clipped it. Ronan held his line, hands steady on the wheel. The car slid past his window in a brief, intimate flash. In that instant, he saw a damp jacket slung over the driver's seat, a fast food cup rolling aimlessly on the floor. Then it was gone. He exhaled slowly. "All right," he said into the CB, thumb brushing the button. Fair call, you local, Lantern. Didn't know about any breakdowns ahead. Been up and down this span more times than I could count, Lantern said. Fog keeps the days from stacking upright, but the road remembers what's on it. Ronan hesitated. An old phrase from some almost forgotten conversation with another driver drifted into his mind. Stories about Greywater and a ghost in the mirror. Not the nasty sort of ghost, not the kind that clawed at glass or screamed warnings of doom. More like a presence some swore appeared only in pea-soup fog, packing behind them at a polite distance. He had dismissed it when he'd heard it months ago, chalking it up to the usual roadside folklore that grew around lonely structures and long, empty stretches. Now, with the wheel humming under his hands and a stranger who seemed to know his truck better than most dispatchers, those stories found new grip. Lantern, you with a company or runnin' independent? He asked. The reply came a little slower this time. Used to run with Bayline Freight, the voice said. Old outfit, long folded, you wouldn't know it. Ronan's throat went dry. Bayline Freight. The name belonged to another era of trucking, one he knew only from faded logos on derelict trailers in forgotten lots and from older drivers' stories. Bayline had gone under decades ago. He swallowed. You say you're behind me, he asked. Cause you've had my rear view for a while now. Been back here a spell, Lantern agreed. Figured you could use the company. Fog's thick tonight, likes to play its tricks. Ronan glanced again at the mirror. The lights glowed back at him, twin pupils in a white face. For a split second he thought he saw, between them, the faint outline of a truck grille he recognized from old brochures. Vertical bars, fender shape not like anything sold in years. Then the image slid away, as if the fog itself objected to his trying to pin it down. The GPS beeped softly. The display refreshed, but the distance reading to the far shore had barely budged, as if the causeway had quietly grown longer while he wasn't looking. You see that on your end? He asked, half to himself, half to the unknown trucker. Feels like this bridge is stretching out. Tonight. Greywater does that when it's socked in, Lantern replied. You start wondering if you got on the wrong end of it, if you're driven back out the way you came. Ronan frowned. That was exactly the uneasy thought that had been curling around the edges of his mind. He cleared his throat. You out here every night, Lantern? He asked. Only when the fog rolls in thick enough, the man said. Fog makes doors where there weren't any. Same for voices. The phrase settled in the small space of the cab, heavy and oddly comforting at the same time. Another truck broke in on the CB for a moment, a younger voice harried. You boys hearin' that Lantern fella up ahead? Caught a whisper bout a breakdown, matches what I just rolled by. Thought that station was just a story. Static washed over the words before they could finish. Lantern chuckled quietly. Seems we've got more ears on us than just you, friend, he remarked. Ronan shifted in his seat, feeling the familiar stiffness of long hours tempered by something more alert. What's the story then? He asked. About this station. Oh, you've heard it, Lantern said. Or parts of it. Bayline wreck on Greywater back in the 80s. Fog thick as soup, driver come out here heavy and hot, saw trouble, jumped on the radio. Got half a dozen rigs slowed before they plowed into stopped cars. Didn't quite get himself stopped, though. The words were simple, the telling gentle. No gore, no lurid detail. Just a fact placed softly on the table between them. Some folks say, Lantern went on, he never quite left the route, or that the road held onto his warnings. You sit in enough cabs, you'll hear a version or two, mostly told third hand on nights like this. Ronan listened to the hum of his own tires, the whisper of fog against the cab, the quiet spaces between Lantern's sentences. You sayin' that's you? He asked eventually. Silence answered him at first. It stretched just long enough for a prickle to walk lightly along his arms. Names are funny out here, Lantern said at last. Might not matter who I was, might matter what you do next. Which is? Check your temp gauge, Lantern suggested. Not the one on the dash, the one in your bones. How are you really feeling? Ronan became suddenly aware of the subtle burn behind his eyes, the way his shoulders had locked an hour ago and never fully relaxed again. The little slips in his thoughts he dismissed, the mild, constant drag of the wipers hypnotizing his attention. Been better, he admitted. Still got time in my log, though. Log'll tell you what's allowed, Lantern replied. Body'll tell you what's wise. There's a difference. Lucky for you, this causeway's got a little mercy built in. Ronan frowned. How do you mean? Up ahead, Lantern said, about half a mile, there's a maintenance spur. Not on your GPS. Little pull-off where the crews stash gear. It's out of the main line of fire. You feelin' what I think you're feelin'. You might want to tuck in there a bit. Let your drums cool. He glanced at his brake gauge, then down at the transmission temperature, all within normal range. The engine purred contentedly. Objectively, the truck was fine. Still, when he listened closely, beyond the hum of the motor and the hiss of tires on damp road, he thought he caught the faintest scent of hot metal just at the edge of perception. Not strong, not urgent, but there. Don't see any sign for a spur, he said, more to test whatever force governed this conversation than out of true protest. That's because it's not for everyone, Lantern said mildly. Fog's opened it tonight. It'll be there when you need it. Won't be if you don't. Ronan stared at the white wall ahead. Truthfully, his vision had begun to blur at the edges, a softening he'd been blamming on the fog. The thought of pulling off, stepping down onto solid concrete, breathing air that wasn't recycled cab atmosphere for a few minutes, it appealed more than he wanted to admit. All right, he said finally. If I see it, I'll take it. The next 100 yards ticked by with aching slowness. Then, as if someone had drawn back a curtain in just one narrow strip of the fog further ahead, a darker line appeared on the right, the mouth of a side road angling gently off the causeway. No sign marked it. No lights announced it. It was simply there, a possibility. He signaled out of habit, though there was no one to see, and eased the rig onto the narrower strip. The feel under his tires changed subtly, the hollow ring of a less traveled surface, the slight rise over a joint between main road and spur. The guardrail fell away. A low, concrete barrier took its place. The side road widened into a rough rectangle of paved space, bordered on three sides by the blankness of marsh fog. A couple of squat, closed maintenance sheds sat side by side, their metal sides streaked dark with moisture. A single tall lamp on a steel pole illuminated the area in a gentle, cone-shaped glow, turning raindrops in the air into tiny, floating sparks. Ronan pulled the truck into the lot and set the brake. The engine came down from working hum to idle, then, with a twist of the key, to silence. The sudden absence of sound rang in his ears. He sat for a moment, listening to the tick-tick of cooling metal, the soft patter of condensed fog on the hood. The world beyond the lamp's circle was an indistinct void. The causeway he had left might as well have been 100 miles away. "Thought you said you were fine," Lantern remarked, the CB speaker making his voice sound closer in the quiet cab. Ronan smiled faintly despite himself. "Truck's fine, me, I'm talkin' your advice." "Good," Lantern said. "Step on back there and give your wheels a smell. Sometimes the nose knows before the gauges do." He hesitated, then he pulled on his jacket and opened the door. Cold, damp air wrapped around him as he climbed down, sliding under his collar, curling into his sleeves. The lamp overhead buzzed softly. Its light made the wet asphalt shine in a shallow, uneven mirror. He walked along the side of the trailer toward the rear, boots sounding dull on the concrete. As he approached the tandem axles, the air grew a shade warmer on his skin. A faint, acrid scent met him. Hot rubber and warmed metal, not sharp enough to be alarming but undeniably present. The hubs on the rear driver's side wheels were just beginning to glow with a dim, ruddy sheen, like coals that had only started to think about catching. He stood there a long moment, watching a tendril of pale steam curl upward from the brake assembly. Could have run like that another hour, maybe more, Lantern's voice said quietly from the CB speaker hidden in the cab above, just loud enough to carry through the open door. Long enough to get off the bridge, long enough to start down that long grade on the far side. Long enough for a whole lot of weight to get ahead of your stopping power. Ronan swallowed. His tongue tasted metallic. He thought of the invisible slope waiting beyond the end of the causeway, the long downgrade into the lowlands. He thought of the fog thickening at the bottom of that hill, where cooler air from the river would catch it. He exhaled, a long, steady breath that carried something out of him, a stubbornness, maybe, or a sliver of denial. Yeah, he admitted softly, guess so. Back in the cab, he sat with the door open, letting the cool air seep in while the brakes rested. The lamp painted the inside of the truck in a gentler light than the dashboard's glow, softening edges, making the familiar clutter look almost theatrical. The dangling keyring, the folded road atlas, the worn cap on the dash. In the mirror, the causeway was nowhere to be seen. Neither were the twin headlights that had followed him. Beyond the edge of the pull-off, the fog was just a blank wall. "You still back there, Lantern?" he asked after a few minutes. A sound like a chair being shifted came through faintly, a tiny scrape layered under static. "For now," Lantern said. "You caught your breath, that's the important part." Ronan hesitated. "You do this a lot?" he asked. "Talk drivers off the road like this?" A soft chuckle. "Only the ones who can hear me," Lantern replied. "Fog opens the line, not everybody tunes in, some run on through, some don't. Can't reach 'em all, but I try when the causeway gets long and the night gets heavy." The way he said it carried no weight of boast or tragedy. It was simply the way of things, like saying the tide came in and went out. Ronan thought of the other voice he'd heard on the CB, the younger, harried one mentioning a story. He thought of all the nights he'd barreled through fog trusting in lines of paint and glowing markers, not knowing which unseen corners of the world might be bending around him. "Why this place?" he asked quietly. "Why Greywater?" "Might because this is where I left more of myself than I meant to," Lantern said after a moment. "Might be the way the marsh holds echoes. Sound travels funny over flat water. Maybe radio waves don't like to let go. Maybe roads remember the folks who have watched over them. Hard to say." Ronan sat with his hands loose in his lap, watching the fog drift in faint, slow currents at the edge of the light. The thought that some fragment of an old driver, his voice, his warnings, could linger here, not trapped but simply present, having turned his last, urgent broadcast into a long, patient vigil, settled into him like a warm stone. After a time, the faint glow on the brake hubs faded. The acrid scent thinned, replaced by cooler air and the clean, wet smell of concrete and marsh. He stood again, checked the wheels with the back of his hand held close but not touching, warm but no longer hot. He climbed back into the cab and closed the door. The small, enclosed world of the truck embraced him. "Looks like I'm good to roll," he said into the mic, more grateful than he could easily put into words. "Then roll you should," Lantern replied. "Stick to your lane, keep it steady. Fog'll thin some once you're off the water. Grade on the far side's no joke, but your brakes'll be up for it now. And Ronan." The sound of his own name, spoken by someone who should not have known it, walked a little chill across his shoulders. "Yeah. Next time the night feels too long," Lantern said softly, "and the road feels like it's repeating itself under you, pay attention to what's in your mirrors. Sometimes helps closer than you think." Ronan swallowed the knot in his throat. "Copy that," he said. He started the engine. The familiar rumble filled the cab, solid and reassuring. The headlights pushed their twin tunnels back into the fog. As he eased the truck out of the pull-off and back toward the causeway, the maintenance spur behind him began to feel less like a real place and more like a pause in the world. At the mouth of the ramp, he glanced one last time into the mirror. For a heartbeat, a single, perfect, balanced heartbeat, he saw them. A pair of headlights in the fog, set just so behind him, not too near, not too far. Between them, the faint outline of an old Bayline freight logo on a broad, square hood. Above that, a suggestion of a man in a cap, one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly on a microphone. These details were not sharp. They were the kind the eye could argue about later, but they were enough. Then the truck behind him, if truck it was, faded as if it had eased back into the fog, its lights dissolving into the undifferentiated glow of the night. He merged once more onto Greywater Causeway. The GPS chirped and redrew, the distance to the far shore dropping at last in neat, logical increments. The road ahead remained narrowed by fog, but the claustrophobic sense of looping, of being trapped in an endless span, eased its grip. The downgrade on the other side of the bay arrived sooner than he expected. He shifted down, feet and hands working with the muscle memory of 100 other descents. The brakes responded cleanly, without complaint. His speed stayed under control, the heavy trailer docile behind him. By the time the fog began to thin, breaking into patches that showed the ghost shapes of trees and the occasional blur of a roadside sign, the radio had settled into the usual mix of late-night callers and soft playlists. No more mentions of high ridge stations or fog-bound legends. No more voice identifying itself as Lantern. At a truck stop 3 hours later, sipping fresh coffee under the hum of fluorescent lights, Ronan mentioned the encounter to a cashier old enough to have been around when Bayline trucks still ran the highways. Her eyebrows rose just a fraction. "Lantern," she said, rinsing a mug. "Now that's a handle I haven't heard in a spell. My dad talked about him. Said there was a driver used to run this causeway like it was his back porch. Kept a lantern charm hanging off his mirror. Went into the fog one night and didn't come out on the far side. Folks say he never really left the airwaves." She shrugged as if to say, "Believe it or don't." Later still, on other nights when fog rolled in thick and the road ahead pinched down to that narrow corridor of sight, Ronan sometimes thought he saw a pair of lights settle in his mirror. Not always, not even often, just now and then when tiredness blurred the world a little and the marsh seemed to draw close. When it happened, he would find his hand drifting almost unconsciously to the brake gauge, to the wheel, to the CB mic. He would listen for a mellow, rough-edged voice braided with static. He never quite heard Lantern again as clearly as on that first night. But every time he caught the faintest whisper of someone saying, "Eyes up, friend." When the road got strange, he felt a tiny knot of tension loosen. Out here, between water and sky and fog, not all the company a driver might find was marked on any map. And somewhere over Greywater Causeway, in the thickest part of the mist, there was said to be a patch of air where radio waves refused to fully fade, where an old Bayline driver still paced behind the lonely trucks, making sure that those who could hear him found a safe place to pull over before the miles got the better of them. Story number 4. The high plains at night had a way of erasing scale. What looked vast under daylight, fields stretching to the horizon, scattered windbreaks of trees, the low rise and fall of old riverbeds, collapsed into a narrow world framed by a windshield. Above, the sky was a dark, invisible ceiling. Below, there was only the unbroken ribbon of highway, the hum of tires, and the steady pulse of white and yellow paint slipping by like a metronome. On State Route 39, somewhere between one sleeping farm town and the next, fog had come in early and stayed, a low, dense ground-hugging blanket that turned the open prairie into a white sea. It was the sort of fog that made fence posts vanish up to their necks and swallowed ditches whole. It wasn't supposed to linger this far inland, this high above the river bottoms, and yet here it was, dense and patient, filling every hollow. Maria's truck moved through it like a ship through heavy weather. Her rig, a red Kenworth with a few battle scars on its bumper, and a small charm of St. Christopher wired above the windshield, pushed forward with a deep, even growl, Inside the cab, the dashboard lights glowed in a muted arc, painting her hands in cool greens and ambers. The CB rested in its cradle, silent but live. A faint orange led the only sign of its readiness. The regular radio played quietly, some late-night station cycling through old rock ballads softened by static. It was 2:02 a.m. by the dash clock. The GPS confirmed the time and added quietly that she had 40 miles to go before she could peel off toward a truck stop she liked. Big gravel lot, decent coffee, always a corner space where she could nestle in for a few hours without worrying about being boxed in. She rolled her shoulders, feeling the small knots of tension that had been building between them. It wasn't fatigue that bothered her. She was well within her hours, second coffee still warm in the travel mug. But something about the fog out here made her body brace in ways it didn't on clear nights. The usual cues were gone. No distant farmhouse lights, no stars, no glow from some town a dozen miles off. Just white on all sides, thick enough that her low beams carved through it only to reach a temporary wall a few truck lengths ahead. The road itself was dry, a blessing. The fog had come without rain, and the pavement retained a ghost of afternoon warmth. The tires sang a muted, constant song on the asphalt, rising and falling slightly with the subtle imperfections in the surface. Maria's eyes tracked the lane lines with practiced care. The solid white on the right, the broken white in the center. When the fog thickened for a few heartbeats and even those dimmed, she let muscle memory and the faint texture of the road under the wheel guide her. In the mirrors, there was almost nothing. The faintest glow of her own trailer lights at the far edge of visibility, smudged red in the dense air. No following headlights. No shapes. It was as if the truck were the only object moving through a world reduced to this single strip of pavement. She didn't mind solitude. She, grown up with it out here, surrounded by acres of land and long lines of fence where the wind wrote its own music. Nights on the road, alone with her thoughts and the engine's pulse, were familiar, almost comforting. But this fog introduced a different texture to the isolation. It made even her own reflection in the glass feel further away. For a while, the drive fell into a rhythm. Check the gauges, glance at the mirrors, sip coffee, breathe. The quiet voice of the radio host faded in and out, talking about some concert in the city she'd be passing near by dawn. The numbers on the GPS ticked downward with slow, reassuring regularity. Then she noticed the other lane. It had been there, of course, all along, the opposing side of Route 39, running parallel to hers on the other side of a low, grassy median. She caught it earlier in brief flashes when the fog thinned. The suggestion of a second strip of dark pavement, its own double lines, its own dull reflectors. No one had been on it. She'd been aware of that in the quiet, absent way one registers an empty room. But now, as the fog shifted almost imperceptibly, she became aware of something different. A faint glow, matching the height and width of headlights, far ahead in that opposite lane. At first she thought it was the blur of some farmhouse light distorted by the mist. Then it moved, a tiny, deliberate slide from one cluster of white to another, and she realized it was a vehicle, something large, judging by the height. A truck, most likely, coming toward her in its proper lane. She leaned a bit closer to the glass, making sure her own lane position was true. The lane lines were clear enough here, their reflective paint catching and throwing back her beams. The center line between the two directions gleamed faintly through the gap in the median. The oncoming lights swelled slowly, halos thickening as they approached through the fog. There was something slightly odd about them. Not wrong, just different. The spacing was a touch narrower than she was used to seeing. Their color a notch warmer, less the cold blue-white of modern LEDs and more the softer tone of older halogens. As they drew nearer, the truck's shape began to form behind the lights, a suggestion of grillwork, the bulk of a trailer. Maria's hand stayed steady on the wheel, eyes flicking between the approaching glow and her own lane. Everything about the encounter felt normal, if muted by the damp cotton pressed against the world. The other rig drew abreast, or should have. For a heartbeat, their headlights overlapped in the fog, the world between them turning milky and bright. Then something strange happened. The oncoming truck never completed its pass. There was no whoosh of air pressure, no vibration, no flash of a chrome grille at the edge of her vision. The halo of its light swelled to a certain size and then held, pinned at the far edge of her perception, as if the other vehicle had matched her speed and was now packing her at a distance rather than closing the gap. Maria's pulse jumped. She kept her wheel level, resisting the urge to slow abruptly. The last thing she needed was to overreact and create the very problem she was imagining away. She checked the right mirror. Trailer lights, fog, left mirror, a suggestion of median white. No sudden shapes. The forward view, her own beams, the familiar lane lines. And to her left and ahead, those twin orbs of light hanging in the mist, too steady, too fixed. Her mind tried to explain it. Perhaps the other truck had pulled into a slow-moving lane on a distant frontage road, its angle making it seem closer. Perhaps there was a bend in the highway she was misreading. Perhaps. A low dip in the road pulled her stomach the slightest fraction down, as if cresting a wave. Her headlights briefly lit up a green mile marker on the right, 47, and a reflective post in the median. In that flash, the shape of the opposite lane sharpened. There, painted on the asphalt to her left, was another set of double lines. 2 lanes, in fact, on that side. One narrow, one slightly wider, their reflective paint aged and a little duller than the lines under her own tires. They were not where they should have been. They sat perhaps half a lane further left than the engineer's plans would have allowed, offset from the visible median by a few feet. And the oncoming lights hung perfectly above them, tracking the invisible center of that misaligned road. The vision lasted only an instant. The fog swallowed the detail, leaving her with a ghost impression. 2 roads, not quite overlaid, one on top of the other but misregistered, like a printing error where the blue layer had slipped. She exhaled, slow and deliberate. "All right," she murmured under her breath. "Now that's different." The word different steadied her. Not dangerous, not impossible, just different. She eased her speed down a few miles per hour, more from instinct than reason. The oncoming lights reacted in kind. They seemed to slow, too, holding their exact relative distance. The 2 of them, she and this pale twin ahead, moved through the fog in tandem, invisible threads of motion linking them. "Anyone running eastbound on 39 right now?" she asked into the CB, her voice sounding louder than she expected in the close cabin. "Got a rig out here I can't quite place eyes on, wondering if my head's just playing tricks." Static crackled, then resolved into the distant voice of some driver far away, mentioning a rest area another 100 miles up, an off-topic fragment that suggested he hadn't really heard her words clearly. No one on her stretch answered. She let the mic fall gently back into its bracket. Gradually, bit by bit, the glow ahead in the left lane faded, whether because the other truck had finally diverged or because the fog had thickened again, she couldn't say. For several long minutes afterward, her body stayed keyed up, waiting for some other strange parallax to announce itself. Then the road fell back into its narrow, hypnotic routine. White lines, fog, the soft, steady breath of the engine. Miles ticked by. The fog, if anything, grew denser. The beams from her headlights created a bright wall just out of reach. It made her feel like she was driving inside the beam of a flashlight pointed at a sheet. Beyond the illuminated space, nothing existed, or if it did, it was no concern of hers. Her breathing settled. The brief oddness of the parallel headlights slipped into the back of her mind, where other road ghosts lived. Remembered near misses, tricks of shadow that had turned out to be signs. The way heat haze could make an overpass look like a mirage in summer. Then she saw the taillights. They appeared in the fog ahead like 2 small, dull coals, glowing low to the ground, out of place. For half a moment she thought they were reflecting her own beams, some trick of angle, but they stayed persistent. She checked her speed, foot easing onto the brake to bleed off a few miles per hour. Couldn't be too careful. A slower vehicle ahead in this soup would be trouble if she closed too fast. The red lights strengthened, taking on more definition. They were not modern LED blazes, but the dimmer, more rounded glow of older bulbs, and they were not quite in her lane. They floated a little to the left, as if attached to a vehicle traveling in a slightly different track than the one carved by her own tires. The hair at the back of her neck prickled. She didn't know yet what was wrong, only that something was. She drew a fraction closer, carefully, cautiously. The shape around the taillights took form. It was a boxy trailer, shorter than her own, with edges softened by the fog. As her beams tasted its rear doors, faint lettering swam into view, the ghost of a logo long out of style, paint faded to near invisibility. She recognized the curve of the font from old photos on trucking forums, a company that had been shuttered before she'd even gotten her CDL. And beneath that logo, in a band of grime that left only a few letters clear, she saw Coop. Her shoulders tightened. The name of her grandfather's old co-op, the one that had run produce out of this region in the 70s, the one she'd grown up hearing about at family gatherings, the one that had lost 2 trucks and 3 drivers on a foggy night on this very highway years before she was born. The story had always been told quietly, without gore. A chain reaction wreck, a sudden slowdown in soup-thick fog, too many heavy rigs with not enough road to stop. Her grandfather had sold the remainder of the fleet not long after. Maria's hands went cold on the wheel. The taillights ahead burned steadily, neither drawing closer nor farther. She realized with a kind of slow-motion clarity that if she lined her truck exactly with the lane markings, those ghost lights would not be in front of her at all. They would be half a lane to the left, hovering over nothing but fog and unmarked earth. The overlay returned in her mind, 2 highways not quite aligned. The one she was on, solid and current. The other, slightly shifted, belonging to some previous iteration of Route 39, maybe a parallel track decommissioned when the road had been widened or straightened. And on that offset road, in the dense white of some other foggy night, the trucks of another era were still driving. A soft shudder ran through her. The sensation was not precisely fear. It carried an odd ache with it, like nostalgia turned inside out. She matched her pace to the dim taillights, letting them set the tempo. They glowed, patient, unwavering. Her own truck hummed forward on its line of paint, the world reduced to this strange duet. One rig in the present, one echo in the past, moving together for a time. Up ahead, the ghost truck's lights brightened and then suddenly dipped, as if its brakes had come on harder. The vague rectangle of its trailer tilted a notch to the right, lane position shifting. Maria's body reacted before her mind caught up. She eased off the accelerator and feathered the brakes, slowing in concert. Just as she did, the beam of her headlights snagged something low and dark in the margin of her lane, a broad, shaggy shape wandering out of the fog. A cow. It stood broadside to her, dull eyes reflecting her light with sudden, startled brightness. Some farmer's gate, not latched quite right, must have let it stray from a field into the even safer-looking void of the highway's shoulder. Had she been running 5 miles faster, or had she not slowed with the faded co-op rig ahead, she might have needed to brake hard enough to risk a skid. Instead, because she had already drawn back, she had room to tap the brakes more firmly, to blare a brief warning on the air horn, to watch the animal lurch back in clumsy surprise toward the ditch. She passed it close enough to see the damp sheen on its hide, the clouds of breath curling from its nostrils. Her heart hammered. She released the brakes, let the truck roll, eyes tracking the ghost taillights. They had resumed their steady glow, as if nothing had happened. As if whatever driver they belonged to in whatever year had reacted to some hazard on his own, and the echo of that reaction had just saved her from sharing a variant of his fate. She swallowed, throat dry. "Okay," she said to the fog and to herself. Thank you." The admission felt strange and right all at once. For a while, she and the Echo truck traveled together, two riffs on the same theme. Now and then she thought she caught hints of other lights further ahead and to the left, a faint glimmer of a tanker's high-mounted markers, the brief flare of brake lights on something with a rounded back, a whole parallel procession, half hidden. And then, as gradually as it had appeared, the tail lights ahead dimmed and bled away into the mist. The feeling of two roads overlaying each other thinned. Maria was left alone again with her own beams, her own gauges, the patient tick of the mile markers. She told herself to chalk it up to tiredness, to old family stories seeping into a night made too quiet by fog. But when the next mile marker emerged, still 47, her hands tightened. She was sure she had already passed 47 once before. The second 47 looked slightly different. Its metal post bore a streak of old rust. The reflective green plate had a bullet ding in one corner. The first one had been clean, straight. The highway department could have misplaced a sign. Signs got replaced and sometimes mistakes happened. But she had a trucker's sense of rhythm for the road. She knew how much ground she'd covered. The numbers should have climbed by now, not doubled back. She drove on. The next sign she saw was for a side road, County 22, pointing off into blind white nothing. No help there. A few minutes later, another mile marker appeared. 47. This one bore a sticker slapped low on the post, peeling at one edge. Different again. Same number. A cool, unyielding sensation coiled in the pit of her stomach. It wasn't panic. Panic would have made her foot heavy or light, would have blurred her awareness. This was clarity of a particular kind, a sharpness that wrapped around the realization that the road tonight was not entirely behaving according to the tidy rules printed in atlases. "Okay," she said softly. "Different, not wrong, just different." As if in answer, far ahead and to her left, a pair of headlights bloomed once more out of the murk. These were higher, broader. A cab over, she thought, from the silhouette she glimpsed in the momentary thinning of fog. Old design. The kind they almost never saw on American highways anymore outside of vintage shows and grainy photos. The truck in the not quite aligned opposite lane was not aimed toward her now. It sat skewed, angled across its lane and partway onto an invisible shoulder, its beams casting out into the white at a slant. As she rolled closer, they brightened, then shuddered as if cut by some object between them and her. In the fraction of a second before her viewpoint lined up with that object, she saw a darker mass where there should have been open air, some blocky obstruction she couldn't make sense of. Her own beams flashed across a patch of road that had shifted subtly under her wheels. The faintest sensation of texture change ran up through the tires, a strip of older asphalt, maybe, rougher and slightly narrower. On the right shoulder, the guardrail vanished for a span of a few yards, replaced by nothing but white. She slowed, instincts shrinking her speed. The sensation was of driving along the edge of something she could not see. Ghost lane, ghost shoulder, ghost drop. The phantom cabover's lights flickered once, twice, then went dark, as if some hand had turned a key in another decade. Her truck crept through the space where that unresolved mass had seemed to be. Nothing bumped under her wheels. Nothing scraped her trailer. She passed through cleanly, heart drumming, imagining in the back of her mind the shape of a stalled car or broken-down rig that had once lurked there in the wrong moment, hooking metal with metal in fog so thick no one saw it coming until they were on top of it. When she emerged into a slightly thinner patch of mist on the other side, the guardrail reappeared, solid and continuous. The lane felt true again under her tires, lines crisp. She let out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. The mile marker that came next read 48. Her relief was disproportionate to the change of a single number. It washed through her, warm and grateful, as if the universe had decided to resume playing by its stated rules, at least on the surface. But when she glanced in the left mirror, for just an instant she thought she saw, far back along that offset lane, a thin line of red dots, taillights strung like beads in the fog. A whole convoy paused on a road no one could drive anymore. By the time she looked back, they were gone. The highway began a slow, gentle climb, nothing steep, just the rise toward a low ridge that separated this stretch of plains from the next. The fog thickened as cooler air pooled on the higher ground. Her headlights paled, their reach narrowed. The radio, as if reacting to something in the airwaves, wavered and dissolved into static. She spun the dial, searching for a clearer signal, and landed for a moment on a voice reading. Weather advisories from another state. Then that, too, vanished into a wash of white noise. The CB crackled once, twice, carrying a fragment of someone's laughter and a mention of a rest area she wasn't near. Then it went quiet. In that quiet, the sound of the engine became a living thing. The low, rhythmic chug, the soft whine when she eased off or pressed down, the faint rattle of something loose in the overhead compartment, keeping a small, syncopated counterpoint. The fog wrapped around the cab so tightly now that she could no longer see the faint silhouette of the hood ornament at the end of her own truck. The world was reduced to illuminated mist and the small, green glow of her instruments. Her grip on the wheel firmed. She set her speed at a steady, conservative number, one she knew from experience would give her room to stop if anything sudden materialized in front of her, but not so slow as to make the truck unstable or invite someone behind her to do something foolish in impatience. Almost there, she told herself. 40 miles had become 19, then 16, then 11. The truck stop still lay ahead, warm lights in her imagination. She could almost smell the coffee brewing there, the faint residual scent of pancake syrup, the old linoleum wax. The first sign of the grade on the far side of the ridge came not from any incline she felt, but from a change in how the fog moved. It seemed to thicken in front of her and thin behind, as though she were pushing it downhill. The slightest tug in the wheel told her they'd crossed the subtle ridgecrest line. And with that shift, the lights returned. Not just one pair this time, but several. Faint, pale clusters scattered along the offset lanes to her left, barely there at first like smudges on a photograph, then sharpening the tiniest degree as the invisible parallel road made a long, sweeping bend. Some were headlights facing her. Some were taillights facing away. All moved at different speeds in different positions, as if she had drawn alongside the shadow of a busy highway in another time. Her heart picked up its tempo. Her hands stayed steady, but her knuckles showed pale against the wheel. The illusion, or whatever it was, had a strange, subdued beauty. The lights were not bright enough to startle, only enough to hint. They seemed to float, unattached to the mass of the trucks they belonged to, tiny red and white stars moving in their own private sky alongside her. In the deeper part of the valley, where the road's downgrade became more insistent, and the weight of her trailer pressed with more confidence against the harness of brakes and gears, the phantom traffic thickened. She could see it now with more certainty that it was not trick of eye. There, a squat tanker rolled slowly, its marker lights a dotted line along its roof. Next to it, a long box truck with high tail lamps idled, flashes of brighter red pulsing now and then as if its driver were riding his brakes. Further up, a flatbed's outline gleamed faintly, its load indiscernible. They occupied that misaligned space to her left, following lanes that no longer existed. Some traveled, some sat skewed, as if responding to an unseen bottleneck. Between them, faint gaps yawned and closed. Maria swallowed. An odd, unbidden thought slid into her mind, that she was being given a view not of one night, but of many, all layered, all replaying their private emergencies and pauses at once. As she eased into a lower gear for the descent, she became aware of a new sound. Not through the speakers, not from the engine, but somewhere at the edge of hearing. A distant chorus of air horns, stuttering, overlapping, all damped by fog and time until they merged into a single, low lament. She recognized, with a sudden, fierce wave of memory, her grandfather's voice from long-ago winter nights, telling her about the echo line that old-timers swore they could see when the weather and the hour were right. A phantom convoy on the other side of the median, made up of every truck that had ever come to grief on that stretch. Not in torment or menace, but in perpetual motion, as if still trying to warn those who came after. He had laughed it off before bed, saying it was just a story, a way to scare rookies into driving carefully in fog. Now, rolling downhill in the thick white with her foot a little firmer on the brake than necessary, Maria wasn't so sure. The phantom lights to her left began to do something new. One by one, slowly, they came to a halt. It happened in little stutters. A set of taillights ahead glowed brighter, then glowed steadily, no longer bobbing with motion. Headlights in the distance dipped and stopped. A tanker's markers ceased their forward creep. Within a minute, the entire ghost lane beside her had become a string of still points, red and white, frozen in position. She glanced at her own speed. The downgrade would happily have had her at 50, 55. She kept herself at 40, then 35. Her engine brake did its part, humming a different note. The real pavement beneath her felt solid, but the hint of unease that had been with her since the first doubled-up mile marker had reached its fullest shape. Up ahead, beyond the reach of her beams, the fog glowed faintly red, as if reflecting a larger cluster of taillights. The invisible parallel highway seemed to be at a full stop. "All right," she whispered, "what are you telling me?" She checked her GPS. The little digital highway on screen showed a long curve and then a straightaway, nothing dramatic. No alerts, no warnings. The grade's steepness was marked but modest. In the absence of official declarations, she trusted something older, the prickle at the base of her skull, the memory voice of people who had driven this route when the map lines had been drawn by hand. She eased her speed down further, 30. Then, as the faint red glow ahead intensified, 25. The real road did not change in any obvious way. The fog thickened and swirled, revealing and concealing patches of battered guardrail, runoff gravel, and the dark mouths of infrequent farm drives. The descent proceeded, one gentle curve at a time. But in the whiteness, shapes suggested themselves. A vague dark smear across the lane, like spilled shadow. A slightly different shine under her lights a truck length ahead, as if the pavement there were damp in a particular way. Black ice, if the temperature had been colder. Tonight, it was likely just a film of dew and oil, maybe thicker in the dip of that old design than her GPS's generic grade diagram accounted for. The ghost line standstill hugged her left like a shoulder-to-shoulder crowd at the periphery of a stage. In the near distance, she could see the suggestion of a cab angled funny, nose toward an invisible embankment, tail half across a lane she would never drive. She kept to 25. Her truck, loaded but obedient, responded with docility. When she reached the part of the descent where the grade eased out and the incline flattened, she recognized it in her bones before the numbers changed. The strain under her boots lessened. The engine's pitch dropped. The air in the cab felt subtly lighter. At that exact moment, the phantom lights beside her started to move again. Not all at once, but in a kind of staggered wave. Headlights nudged forward. Taillights began to bob gently, as if their trucks had shifted from brake to crawl. Within 24 heartbeats, the parallel highway was in motion again, its spectral congestion easing. As the last of the steep section dropped away behind, the fog began to thin. Not dramatically, just enough that she could make out the ghost of a tree line beyond the shoulders, the faintest hint of stars up in the murk. The overlay of the second road faded with it. The misalignment that had made the echoes visible became less distinct. Ghost lane and real lane phased into each other until she was looking, once more, at nothing but her own reflection in the side glass and the suggestion of a median beyond. By the time the downgrade had flattened entirely and the highway stretched ahead in an honest, level line, there were no more unusual lights packing her. The dash clock read 3:11. The GPS insisted she had only 20 miles left to the truck stop, and now it believed it. The CB crackled as she approached the outskirts of ordinary geography again. Voices talked about weather rolling in from the north, about a good pie at an exit 2 states away, about a kid back home learning to ride a bike. The regular radio found a country song, clear and bright, unmarred by static. She drove the remaining miles in a thoughtful quiet. The fog thinned to streaks, then patches, then a soft, low mist that clung only to the edges of fields. The sky opened above, stars emerging like perforations in a great dark dome. The truck stop's neon finally rose ahead, a tiny constellation all its own. In the wash of sodium vapor and halogen that filled the lot, the night's strangeness felt more like something she'd imagined than something she'd experienced. Trucks were lined up in their rows, breathing softly in diesel. A dog barked somewhere near the edge of the property. Inside, the diner gave off the comfortable, low murmur of people and clinking plates. Maria parked, set the brake, and sat for a moment with her hands resting loose on her thighs, feeling the faint phantom sensation of the wheel under them, of the long ribbon of road humming beneath. In the diner, over coffee that tasted both too sharp and not sharp enough after her hours alone, she found herself in line behind a man in his late 60s. His jacket faded along the seams where countless nights had rubbed it against doors and seats. On the back was a patch, frayed but legible, a co-op logo with the same general curve as the ghost lettering she'd seen through the fog. On impulse, she said, "Excuse me, that co-op, you run with them long?" He glanced back, eyes crinkling. "Used to," he said. "A long time ago, before the company sold off the last of the trailers. Kept the jacket, though, feels wrong to throw it out." She nodded. "My grandfather ran with a co-op out here," she said. "Back in the 70s. Wonder if it was the same one." "Wouldn't surprise me. Small world on a big road," he replied. She hesitated, then added, "He ever tell you stories about an Echo line on 39? The man's expression shifted, not to incredulity but to a slow, quiet recognition. "He tell you that one too?" he asked. "About the ghost convoy in the fog?" "Something like that," she admitted. "Did you ever?" He gave a small, non-committal shrug. "You run this road long enough, you see all kinds of things," he said. "Fog plays in the same ditches where memory likes to sit. Maybe there's a bit of our wrecks that never quite leave. Maybe the road remembers for us when we forget to tell the new kids where to take it slow." He lifted his coffee in an informal salute. "Whatever's out there, I figure it's on our side. Most nights, anyway." Later, back in her cab, Maria lay in her bunk with the curtain half drawn, the hum of nearby idling engines a low lullaby. The fog outside the yard lights was thin now, more decorative than dangerous, curling in little tendrils around lamp posts. Sleep came slower than usual. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those faint rows of lights suspended in the mist beside her, pausing and then moving as if obeying some choreography written in another age. She did not know if what she'd seen was the literal imprint of past accidents, a quirk of tired senses, or something stranger that lived in the overlap between drivers' stories and night conditions. She only knew that when she thought of the cow on the road, and of the unseen hazard at the bottom of the grade, and of how precisely her speed had matched the ghost rig's reactions, she felt a quiet thankfulness. On other fog-bound nights after that, when the landscape shrank and the signage replayed itself in suspicious ways, she kept a subtle eye on the empty median and the left beyond. Now and then, just now and then, she thought she saw a pale glow where no modern truck ran. When she did, she matched her speed to it for a while, the way a swimmer might keep pace with a current rather than fight it. She aligned her choices not only with the code in her GPS and the numbers on her gauges, but with whatever old lessons the road might be replaying in the whiteness. No one she told believed her entirely. Most just smiled and said their own versions of fog plays tricks. A few older drivers didn't smile exactly, but nodded instead, like she'd been admitted to some low, quiet fellowship that didn't advertise itself. And out on State Route 39, when the mist rolled down from the hills and filled the low places, making mile markers repeat and guardrails vanish, there were nights when anyone looking very closely might have thought they saw, just beyond the reach of modern headlights, the faint twin running of another world's traffic, moving, stopping, starting again, as if still working very hard all these years later to make sure that this time the trucks made it safely through. Story number 5. The freight yard did not look like much in daylight, just an expanse of cracked pavement and organized steel, latticed with painted lines and towering stacks of containers. From the interstate, you could glimpse its cranes and gantries behind chain-link fence and razor wire, a low, sprawling industrial organism humming with forklifts and idling trucks. At night in the fog, it became something else. Neil eased his day cab through the gate of the Riverbend Intermodal Yard at 11:47 p.m., headlights cutting through a thin, early haze. The guard in the shack, a man with a knit cap pulled low and a reflective vest zipped to his chin, checked his paperwork with the weary efficiency of someone whose shift was almost over, stamped the manifest, and waved him in with 2 short chops of his flashlight. "Slot in the far west block," the guard said, pointing his chin into the murk. "Lane J, row 42, you're late. They might have dropped it for you already." "Wouldn't be the first time," Neil replied, giving a half-smile that felt more like habit than amusement. Beyond the gate, the yard opened like a flat maze. Sodium lamps perched on tall poles spilled cones of pale gold onto the rows of asphalt, their light thickened by the moisture in the air. Cranes stood like frozen mechanical herons, their arms extended over pyramids of steel boxes stacked 3-4 high. Painted lane letters, A, B, C, were stenciled at intervals on the pavement, half hidden under the wet sheen. A low fog lay in the hollows and between the stacks, not yet the wall-to-wall shroud the river sometimes brought, but enough to blur the boundaries. In the distance, beyond the yard's outer fence, Neil could hear the subdued rush of the river itself, broad and slow, moving unseen through the darkness. Every now and then, a train horn sounded on the far side of town, low and mournful. He drove past the loading bays and the cluster of office trailers, following the reflective signs deeper into the complex. Most of the yard's bustle had already ebbed. A few spotlights still illuminated late-shift workers sealing doors and checking chassis pins, but the forklifts that had clattered and beeped during the day now sat in rows, silhouettes hunched and still. His truck's headlights licked over stacks of containers bearing names like Aurora LINES, Northern Star Shipping, PANWORLD. Their colored sides, blue, red, dull green, were muted in the night, turned into blocks of shadow. The fog thickened as he turned toward the west block. It gathered in low drifts between the stacks, rolling in slow, barely perceptible currents. The air that came in through his cracked window smelled metallic and damp, with an undercurrent of something riverine, mud, wet concrete, the faint, cold sweetness of water weeds. He checked the dash clock. 12:03, technically tomorrow now. The digital glow of the GPS on his dash showed his little triangular arrow moving across a pale blueprint of the yard, lines and right angles, blocks marked with letters. The screen insisted that if he drove 3 more lanes west and turned left, he would be precisely where his assigned container waited. He found Lane J by the stenciled letter on the ground, the paint worn but visible in his beams. Row numbers were on rusting posts at the ends of each corridor between stacks. He crept along, reading them as they slid by. 38, 40, 41. The numbers and the fog. Row 42's slot was half filled with damp air and silence. No container matching his number sat on its designated chassis. The yard around him was still, The only movement the modest swirl of fog reacting to his truck, passing. He sat. For a moment, engine idling, listening. Somewhere nearby, a loudspeaker crackled faintly with an announcement too garbled to make out. A forklift beeped in reverse in some other quadrant of the complex, the sound arriving strange and muffled. An engine roared further off, then subsided. Neil keyed the radio to the yard's internal channel. West Block, Lane J, row 42. Looking for container RBU 4931. Anyone got eyes on it? Static, then a response, thick with fatigue. RBU 4931, yeah, that one's hot. Should be on chassis somewhere near. Check lane H, they might have nudged it for the pilot car, or they forgot to ping the system again. Story of my life. Neil thanked him, signed off, and eased back into gear. He retraced his path to lane H, the fog hugging the sides of his truck a little tighter now. The yard lights overhead seemed dimmer, their halos more opaque. His headlights found the shining bands of wet steel and asphalt, the towering, dark Lego brick silhouettes of containers on either side. The first time he saw RBU 4931, it was almost by accident. The number stenciled on the box's side caught his eye as his beam slid across it. White letters on a faded red panel, sitting square on a chassis, lock pins gleaming with fresh grease. He pulled up beside it and checked the manifest pin to the trailer frame. Correct origin, correct destination. His client's name printed clearly, a familiar string of letters. Good. One less thing to wrestle with tonight. Hooking up the trailer was a set of practiced motions, backing under with care until he felt the solid, satisfying lock of kingpin into fifth wheel. He climbed out, breath puffing faintly in the chilly air, and checked the connection with a flashlight, its narrow beam cutting through suspended droplets that hung like tiny, luminous beads. The more time he spent outside, the more the fog seemed to notice him. It pressed closer, dampening the fringes of his hair, soaking into the cuffs of his jacket. The sounds of the yard, distant engines, the occasional clang of metal, felt farther away, as if the white air were swallowing their echoes. Lights from the main administrative building on the eastern side of the yard were no longer visible at all. The cranes loomed overhead as dim suggestions, their outlines softened to almost absence. By the time Neil climbed back into his cab and shut the door, his small, enclosed space felt almost overly bright and dry. The heater ticked quietly. The plastic of the steering wheel was warm under his hands. The air smelled of coffee from the half-empty thermos in the cup holder, and the faint, lingering trace of diesel that clung to his clothes. He tapped his GPS. The arrow representing his truck had shifted slightly, showing him now attached to a small rectangle, the system's way of indicating he was hauling something. The map suggested a simple path back out. Follow lane H straight east, turn right at lane 4, then south to the main gate. Simple, he rolled forward. Fog swirled lazily in his headlights, a pale river flowing around the truck. The painted lane markings were still visible under the wet gleam, the big H, then the numbers counting down, 42, 40, 38. At row 32, something subtle slipped. He didn't feel the shift as movement. It was more like the faint sensation of missing a step that wasn't there. The way your stomach drops for an instant when the rhythm of a staircase doesn't match what your feet expect. A moment where the humming alignment between mind and environment misfired. Lane H continued ahead, painted on the pavement. The containers still flanked him in their organized canyons, but when he passed the next row marker and glimpsed its number in his beams, it did not say 30. It said 42. Neil blinked, checked his mirrors, his speed, the GPS. The screen insisted he was moving east, inch by neat inch, following an unbroken line. The arrow's nose pointed toward the little exit icon with assured confidence. If the system was to be believed, he just crossed row 30, not somehow looped back. He slowed to a crawl and peered out through the fog at the post. The number was plain, 42. The paint was slightly chipped on the lower corner. A strip of reflective tape wound around the upright, peeling at one edge. The 42 he'd seen before had a large smear of dried mud across its middle. This one did not. They were not the same sign, but they bore the same number. "All right," he murmured, "all right." He rationalized. Maybe the yard planners had duplicated a row number by mistake. Maybe what he thought of as row 42 was 42A, and this was 42B, and no one had bothered to suffix the labels. Industrial environments accreted quirks like that over time. Names and numbers made sense only to the people who spent years inside them. He checked his path. Forward, turn right, out. He drove on. The second time row 42 appeared. The knot low in his spine tightened. This marker had a bottom edge eaten away by rust, the digits slightly crooked. It passed by his window at the same unhurried pace as the others, emerging from the whiteness, sitting in his beams for a few heartbeats and then dissolving back into it. Lane H under his tires, Lane H ahead, Lane H behind. The container stacks seemed taller now, their upper levels vanishing completely into the thick, pale ceiling of fog. The light from the sodium lamps filtered down through that milky air in a way that made everything beneath look underwater. Shadows had no hard edges. Colors bled to grays and muted browns. He tapped the GPS screen again. It showed him still moving in a straight line, the arrow approaching the turn. He blinked at the yard diagram. The north-south lanes were numbered, the east-west ones lettered. According to the map, he should see lane 4's perpendicular cross in a few more truck lengths. When he reached an intersection, he turned right, trusting the display more than his own senses. The truck responded with that heavy, familiar sway, trailer tracking behind him. Pavement under his wheels shifted in pattern. New containers lined his view, these ones painted in different, faded brands. He drove maybe 30 yards before he noticed the lane letter stenciled on the asphalt ahead. H. He had not left it at all. Fog pressed up against the glass. The interior of the cab felt suddenly very small. The yard's loudspeakers crackled to life overhead, making him flinch. A voice, distorted and distant but clear enough, announced, "All trucks prepare to exit via Gate 1. Lanes J through L proceed east to main artery. Repeat, all loaded units exit Gate 1 via eastern lanes." Neil glanced toward where Gate 1 should be, a glow of brighter light, a cluster of traffic signals. He saw nothing but fog and the melting shapes of more containers, their sides beaded with moisture. No hint of the outer fence, no glare from the road beyond. He thumbed his CB, Riverbend Yard. "This is Neil in Lane H, you got a copy. Think I'm turned around here. Visibility's like soup." Silence followed, then a faint, broken murmur, as if two conversations from different channels had bled together. A man's voice, tinny and worn, said, "Came in off the river, can't see the towers no more," before dissolving into static. Neil tried again, slower. "Riverbend copy. This is Unit 732 headed for Gate 1. Need a vector." No answer. The yard's own loudspeakers hissed, then fell silent. He inhaled deeply, exhaled. Years on the road had taught him that panic rarely helped. Night cobbled strange shapes out of ordinary things. Fog did even stranger work. The trick was to keep to what you could verify. The feel of the road, the steadiness of your hands, the information in front of you that wasn't obviously lying. The GPS, he told himself, was glitchy in tight industrial zones at the best of times. He could be in a narrow loop of reflective surfaces, confusing its sense of direction. The yard's layout, a rectangle on a screen, did not capture the subtle curves and offsets that real pavement sometimes had. He chose a simple strategy: turn around. At the next clear break between stacks, he found space to swing wide and execute a slow, deliberate U-turn, watching his trailer in the mirrors, making sure it didn't bite into any corners. The fog swallowed sound, so the usual whine of tires on the yard's surface sounded oddly muffled. The air around the cab thinned a fraction as he rotated, then thickened again when he pointed the other way. He headed back along lane H, counting row markers: 40, 38, a gap where 36 should have been, the post bare and empty, then 42. This 42 had a rag of caution tape flapping limp from a nail. He chuckled once, short and humorless. Very funny, he told no one. The guard's shack at the gate existed in his memory as a perfectly ordinary point on a compass, always due east, always attainable by following sufficient asphalt in approximately that direction. Now, east had become theoretical. The yard's geometry no longer seemed fully Euclidean. He tried turning left at the next intersection instead of right. Lane F, the same bulk of containers, the same pale rectangles of stacked steel. The numbering on the rows shifted. He saw 29, 27, then 42. It was a different sign again. Its post was newer, unblemished metal, the numbers crisp. He could have filled a catalog with the minor variations had he been inclined. As he crept forward, the fog thickening to the consistency of breath, something loomed in his left mirror, a row of parked trucks. They materialized slowly, as if drifting up out of a submerged depth. Their outlines were soft at first, then sharpened. A dozen maybe more, snub noses and long hoods and boxy cabs, all backed into marked slots between stacks, their trailers flush with the lines, huddled like animals waiting out bad weather. Neil's heart climbed into his throat. He hadn't seen any other drivers hook up or park near this block when he'd first come through. The yard had been sparsely populated, and yet here was a whole little congregation of rigs, side by side, their windows dark, their cabs empty. He slowed, letting his headlights sweep across them. Some bore logos he knew well, companies he'd shared dock space with for years. Others carried names he recognized from old photographs and shop stories, brands that had folded or been bought out decades back. One cab near the end of the row caught his eye. It was white, with a dull silver stripe, the paint gone chalky. The company name above the door matched the one on the laminated badge clipped to his own vest. His company, in an old font, the way it had looked before the rebrand 10 years ago. The truck's number, stenciled near the grill, was familiar too, 732. His own. He stared, pulse hammering. The cab in the slot was a slightly older model of the one he now sat in, a different style mirror, a different arrangement of marker lights, but the overlaps were impossible to dismiss. A ragged strip of duct tape patched a crack in the bumper in exactly the place he'd once hit a post at a loading dock, back when he'd driven his first assigned unit. He'd signed that truck back to the fleet years ago when they'd cycled him into a newer rig. He'd watched it driven away toward auction, knowing it would end up in some far state wearing someone else's colors, or parted out. Here it sat, parked between towers of fog-shrouded steel, its windshield opaque with a film of grime that no one had wiped away. No lights burned inside. No silhouette moved behind the wheel. Neil's skin crawled with a quiet, electric unease. The sensation was less like fear of something terrible, and more like the vertigo of seeing your own reflection in a window when you thought no one was there. He did not stop. Instinct told him that halting beside that old, silent twin of his career would be a kind of acknowledgement he wasn't ready to make. Instead, he drove on, following lane F until the row of sleeping rigs disappeared once more into the white. The yard's loudspeaker crackled again. All trucks gate change. All trucks gate 2 now open for exit. Follow directional signs. The voice was the same toneless, hollow baritone, yet something in its cadence felt off, as if the recording had been stretched slightly, its vowels pulled thin. Neil thought of the guard's casual wave when he'd first entered. Gate 1 had been the only point of access mentioned. Gate 2, in his mental map, was a fenced-off construction area, newly poured but unused, his company email chatter full of speculation about when it would open. He had an odd, fleeting sense of being inside an old instruction that didn't quite apply to his version of the yard. "Gate 2 is closed," he said aloud, both to remind himself and to test whether the world would argue. The fog had no opinion. He checked the horizon line of the yard lights. There wasn't one. The fog had eaten even that. His truck idled under him, a small, reliable engine in an unreliable geometry. He did what drivers had done for decades when instruments and signage and familiar patterns all went strange. He looked up. Above, beyond the hazy pall of sodium glow, he could just make out the faintest blur of crane tops and the higher reaches of stacked containers, their blocks fading into nothingness. No stars. The fog here was too thick for that. But somewhere higher up, unstated and unmoved, the night sky existed. He took his bearings from sound instead. The river had a voice. It was subtle, far off, but constant. A soft, ceaseless susurration of water moving against banks, around pilings, past unseen rocks. Neil rolled down his window an inch and listened. There it was, under the hum of his own engine. A low shushing, directionless at first, then gradually resolving into a sense of over there. The way a person talking in another room could be located by the tenor of their muffled words. The river lay west of the yard, beyond its outermost fence. The gate he had entered through faced roughly east. If he could orient himself by that whispering sound, he might escape the tyranny of row numbers and duplicated letters. He killed his radio volume. The moment the music and static faded, the quiet occupied the cab like a new presence. He listened again. The river's murmur came from his left and slightly behind. He pictured the yard diagram in his mind, rotated it until left and behind matched west. If that was west, then his current facing was roughly south. Gate 1 should be east of here. Gate 2, still under construction, sat in the southeast corner. The administrative offices were off to the northeast. He flipped the mental map over itself, laid it atop the sensory one. The overlay did not fit perfectly. The way the phantom highways on the foggy plains had not aligned, but it gave him a direction to favor. He turned his truck carefully until the river's whisper was directly behind him, and the damp, unseen weight of the rest of the yard felt balanced to either side. Then he chose a lane that led forward into that uncertain east and took it. He stopped paying strict attention to the painted letters at his wheels. JHF they came and went, repetitions and oddities. He noted instead the faint incline under his tires when the ground sloped, the shifting timbre of the engine as it pulled, the slight temperature change when he passed near where refrigerated trailers slept, humming low. Occasionally, in the edges of his vision, he saw other trucks, parked at angles or tucked into back rows, their logos from other eras. He did not catalog them, though some part of his mind did, by reflex. A faded green tractor with a grain co-op's emblem he knew from childhood. An old cabover with a paint scheme he'd only ever seen in trucking magazines his father had kept. They were not menacing. They were waiting, maybe. Witnesses in the fog, silent, watching a line of drivers find their way out again and again. After what might have been 10 minutes or an hour, time had stretched thin in the white. Neil saw something new. Light. Not the sodium pools of yard lamps, but the harsher, flatter glare of halogen through glass. It came at him not from above, but from the side, a bright rectangle hanging in the fog like a doorway cast into it. As he drew closer, the rectangle resolved into the broad window of the guard shack, illuminated from within. A human figure sat at the desk, shoulders hunched over paperwork. Gate 1. Relief washed through him. Warm and almost embarrassing. He hadn't realized how tightly his jaw had clenched until it eased. The shack sat where it always had, crouched beside the dual swing arms of the gate, their red and white stripes dimmed by dew. Beyond them, the faint glow of interstate lights bloomed in the distance, blurred by lingering mist but undeniably real. He rolled forward, cueing. Himself in front of the barrier. The guard looked up, eyes narrowing as he recognized the truck's company logo. He slid the window open with a practiced motion. "Find what you were looking for?" he asked, voice flat with the hour. "Yeah," Neil said. "Found and hooked. Took me a bit to get turned around. That fog out there's something else tonight." The guard grunted. "River blows it in and forgets to take it back," he said. He slid a clipboard through the window for the signature. Neil scrawled his name, the pen leaving a faint trail in the slightly damp paper. "Busy night?" Neil asked, more for his own curiosity than politeness. "Lot of trucks go out before me." "Couple," the guard said. "Last one left maybe 40 minutes back. You're the last of the night for loaded exit. Rest of 'em are sleepin' in their cabs till morning. Yard's quiet as it gets." Neil hesitated, then said, "There a back lot where you keep old units. Retired stuff. Ever park 'em up by West Block F?" The guard frowned. "Nah, old stuff goes straight out. Auction or scrap. Don't hold on to 'em. Why you see a relic out there?" His tone tried for amusement and almost made it. "Something like that," Neil said, non-committal. The guard regarded him for a second then, perhaps sensing more in his expression than was spoken, added, "You're not the first driver to get turned around back there when it's socked in. Yard used to be laid out different, way before my time. Got maps on the wall back in the office showing, old row numbers, different gates. They say when the fog's heavy enough, radios pick up calls from crews ain't run this place in years." He snorted softly, as if to blow off his own words. "Stories, you know." Neil offered a thin smile. "Yeah," he said, "stories." The barrier arm lifted with a hydraulic hiss. Beyond it, the open road waited, lines bright and clear even in the patchy, receding fog. His headlights reached farther here, unimpeded. The world beyond the yard felt honest in its way. He eased through the gate, gave the guard a small salute, and merged onto the access road that would take him to the interstate. As he accelerated, the vibrations under his boots changed from the slightly hollow ring of the yard's aging pavement to the solid thrum of newer blacktop. In his side mirror, carefully angled, he could see the yard behind him, a lit rectangle enclosed by chain link, the tops of cranes just visible as faint, dark strokes against a glowing sky. The fog looked thinner from out here, its edges fraying. For a moment, as he crested the slight rise before the highway on-ramp, he thought he saw, in the far western corner of that illuminated box, a line of parked trucks, side by side. Their cabs were distinct for only a heartbeat, old colors, old logos. Among them, a white tractor with a dull silver stripe and a familiar number. Then he was past the rise, and the fence and its secrets dropped out of view. On the interstate, the fog was sporadic, patches that came and went, low to the ground like spilled milk. Overhead, a few stars pricked through gaps in the cloud cover. The hum of his engine settled into its usual rhythm. The GPS arrow, now representing a truck on a real, long road instead of a tiny icon in a digital yard, moved with satisfying certainty. He drove, and the yard fell behind. Later, at a fuel island a couple of states over, swapping stories with another driver while they waited for their tanks to top off, Neil mentioned the fog at Riverbend and the way the rows had seemed to repeat. The other man, older, with a sun-cracked face and a ball cap stained by decades of sweat, nodded slowly. "Fog Yard," he said. "Heard about that. Back when the rail and the truck operations were still sorting themselves out, they changed the layout in a hurry. Old lanes, new lanes, old gates shut down, new ones opened. Couple bad nights out there. Pile-ups in the yard itself. Folks say if you run it on a real thick night, you can still catch voices on the yard channel calling lanes that don't exist anymore, or see trucks parked in rows they tore up years back." Neil stared at the shimmering dazzle on the concrete under their feet. "You ever see it yourself?" The man shrugged, a small, non-committal lift of shoulders. "Something like it," he said. "Once or twice, long time ago, learned a trick, though." "What's that?" "When the fog gets thick enough to make the yard bigger than it is," he said. You don't trust the paint under your wheels or the squawk on the loudspeakers. You trust where the river is. Rivers don't move their beds as fast as men move concrete. And you trust that the trucks that never got out are happy enough to stand still and show you where not to go if you're paying attention. They finished fueling in companionable silence. Years afterward, when Neil found himself again in Riverbend on a night when the fog poured in low and heavy from the water, he felt it settle around the cab with a more familiar weight. The yard lights glowed in their halos. The stacks of containers loomed. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn sighed. He took his bearings from the river and from the quiet voice inside that remembered other nights, other roads, other faint glows of parked trucks behind veils of white. And when the row markers repeated, as they did on that kind of night, he smiled without great surprise and let his roots bend around the places where the fog seemed to want to show him something. He never again saw his old truck so clearly as he had that first time, but sometimes in the corner of his eye, he caught the suggestion of a familiar hood in a line of silhouettes, watching, not beckoning, not threatening, just there. A reminder that even in the most industrial, logical of spaces, there were corners where the maps had not fully kept up with the stories. And on those nights when the yard grew too large and the rows too many, there were drivers, some present, some perhaps only half so, who waited quietly in their parked cabs, lanterns in the fog, marking the edges of the paths best left untraveled. Story number 6. The mountains rose out of the flatland like a dark, slow-motion wave, their shoulders layered one behind the other until they disappeared into the low-hanging clouds. At their base, along the shallow valley floor, fog had pooled in thick, pale blankets, covering fields and tree lines and the low glimmer of distant farmhouses. The interstate threaded through it all, a thin line of asphalt pulled taut toward the black silhouettes ahead. Jonah's truck climbed steadily toward the pass, engine note deepening as the grade increased. His rig, a silver Freightliner with a few years on it and a row of amber marker lights along the roof, cast 2 clear tunnels of light into the mist. Everything beyond those tunnels was suggestion. The beam tips died into a wall of white that gave up only the nearest road signs and guardrail posts at the last possible second. Inside the cab, the world shrank to familiar shapes, the worn leather of the steering wheel beneath his hands, the gentle sway of the air freshener dangling from the dash vent, scent long gone but motion somehow comforting, the quiet digital glow of the gauges, the soft background hiss of the heater keeping the chill at bay. The clock in his dash read 1:23 a.m. The GPS on its suction mount confirmed the time and added a steady reminder. Longnight tunnel, 7 miles ahead. Jonah took a slow breath and let it out through his nose. The tunnel had a reputation, the kind that began as practical caution and over the decades had grown moss in the form of stories. He'd heard the older hands talk about it at truck stop counters, about brake failures on the downhill, about panicked drivers white-knuckling through the miles of concrete tube. And when the talk shifted into the late hours and the coffee ran thin, about stranger things, voices in the dark, reflections in mirrors that didn't quite match. He'd been through it twice before, both times by day and in good weather. Apart from its length, it ran nearly 3 miles under the mountain, and its slightly stale, metallic smell, it had been unremarkable, just another bit of engineering. Tonight, with fog so thick the mountains themselves were ideas rather than shapes, it felt different. He climbed. The road shouldered upward in slow, patient curves. Fog clung to the trees that lined the median, beating on bare branches and evergreen needles. Overhead, the faint glow of distant sodium lamps marked the run-up to the tunnel's mouth, a smeared necklace of light strung along the dark slope. The CB radio crackled intermittently, carrying fragments of chatter from drivers somewhere else on the pass, a mention of black ice higher up, some tired laughter about a vending machine that ate someone's dollar. Jonah kept the volume low, the voices more texture than information. The regular radio, tuned to a late-night station out of a city on the far side of the range, faded in and out. A song about rain gave way to static, then surfaced again with a chorus that sounded like it was being sung from another room. The first advance sign for the tunnel escaped the fog at the last moment, reflective green letters swelling toward him. LONGNIGHT Tunnel, 5 miles, lights on, tune radio 2, 530 AM4 advisories. He flicked his headlights switch, confirming low beams. They were already on. Even his high beams would have been useless in this thickness, blooming off the whiteness and blinding rather than helping. He twisted the radio's tuner down to 530 AM. For a moment there was nothing but a low, dense hush. Then a voice faded in from the noise, flat and unemotional, like a recorded announcement playing off old tape. Attention motorists, long night tunnel weather advisory in effect. Due to temperature differential, expect reduced visibility and localized fog pockets inside tunnel. Maintain posted speed. Use caution. No stopping except in designated bays. Repeat, no stopping except in designated bays. The message looped, repeating with the exact same inflection. Jonah listened to it twice, then turned the volume down until it became a low murmur beneath the hiss of his tires. As he gained elevation, the outside fog did something unexpected. It thinned. It didn't vanish entirely. It stayed as low streaks along the ground and veils between the trees. But the air ahead of him gradually cleared enough that he could see the pale concrete of the road's surface, the full length of the guardrail, the shadowed bulk of the mountainsides pressing close. Then, rounding a last, gentle bend, he saw it. The tunnel entrance, carved into the rock like an enormous, rectangular mouth. A massive concrete portal framed it, stained by decades of exhaust, its edges damp with seeping water. Yellow sodium lamps burned above the opening, their light reflecting off the dampness and the fine suspended mist drifting from within. Above the tunnel, mounted on a heavy gantry, a variable message sign glowed amber. Slow 245, fog in tunnel, lights ON. Jonah eased off the accelerator. The truck settled into a lower, more controlled speed, engine brake humming softly when he tapped it. The pavement darkened under his wheels, still dry but gleaming here and there, where groundwater seeped up to the surface near the entrance. As his headlights washed across the concrete lip, a thin, low mist spilled out, crawling along the road's surface like something alive. It curled around his tires as he rolled in, smearing into ghostly tendrils that licked at the undercarriage. The world outside dropped away. Inside Long Night Tunnel, everything was different. The sky ceased to exist. In its place, a curved ceiling of concrete lined with a repeating pattern of rectangular tiles and ventilation fans. The fans hummed overhead, their blades hidden behind metal grates, moving the tunnel's stale air at a slow, relentless pace. Long rows of fluorescent fixtures marched along the ceiling, their light sickly and diffuse. It reflected off the wet sheen on the roadway and off the condensation beating on the smooth, tiled walls. Between the fixtures, shadow pooled in scalloped shapes, each patch of dimness expanding into the next until the far end of the tunnel was nothing but a suggestion of continued space. Fog itself had taken up residence inside. It wasn't as thick as outside had been in the valley, but it lay in banks along the floor and hung in thin layers in the air, made luminescent by the artificial light. Jonah's headlights picked out its swirls and shifting currents, cutting through them in clear cones that only emphasized how little of the tunnel he could see at once. The lane markings here were bright and freshly painted, a broken white line down the center, a solid line on either side. Reflective markers embedded in the concrete at intervals cast back his light in tiny, bright sparks, a man-made constellation leading into the interior. Sound changed, too. The hum of his engine, the hiss of tires, the faint creak of the trailer, everything echoed back at him, slightly delayed, wrapped in the soft reverb of a massive enclosed space. It was like hearing his world through a subtle filter. He checked his speed, 43, good, the posted limit. His hands found their place on the wheel and stayed there, measured and firm. The radio hissed, then resolved again into the tunnel advisory loop. Visibility may be reduced, no stopping except in designated bays. He turned the volume down further until it was barely audible. The first 100 yards passed with uneventful, almost hypnotic regularity. Tiles, lights, fans, fog. The road curved gently to the right, then back to the left, its path dictated by the rock it pierced. Overhead, signs reminded him, stay in lane, no U-turns, keep moving. Far ahead, a set of red taillights appeared, small and faint, marking another vehicle in the tube. A car, judging by the height. It moved steadily, its glow bobbing up and down in minute increments as it encountered the tunnel's subtle imperfections. As Jonah watched, the taillights brightened briefly, then dimmed. The car must have tapped its brakes. Maybe the driver was as uneasy in this enclosed, fog-smeared world as he was. He kept his following distance generous. The tunnel's length meant that any sudden stop could ripple backward through a line of vehicles in unpleasant ways. Better to give everyone room. After a while, he noticed distance markers. Small, rectangular signs mounted low on the right-hand wall, passing in a consistent rhythm. 0.5 miles, 1 miles, 1.5 miles. Each one a simple declaration of how far he had traveled within this concrete throat. He passed the 1.5 miles sign and felt a subtle easing. Halfway, more or less. Ahead, the faint impression of a dip in the light suggested the tunnel might open a little, an illusion of nearing the exit. The CB crackled unexpectedly, a sharp burst that made him flinch. A voice cut through the static, thin and tinny, layered with a faint echo that spoke of large, hard surfaces. Breaker 19, any unit, read. The words came in with a jitter like an old tape with a worn section. Long night, break smoke, anyone copy. Jonah's hand went to the mic by reflex. Copy long night. This is southbound in the tube, what's your location? He glanced at the lane ahead. Nothing but fog and tiles and the steady taillights of the car, now a little farther on. The reply was distant, as if coming from the wrong end of a long pipe. Smoke at the halfway, truck stacking up, can't see, the voice faded, then snapped back in with a half-word. Locked, no air. Then nothing, just the tunnel advisory murmuring on AM, as calm and unconcerned as ever. Jonah thumbed the CB again. Any units in Long Night Tunnel, you hear that. Got a driver callin', break smoke halfway. Silence, the car ahead maintained its steady pace. No sudden glare of brake lights, no horns. He listened harder, as if he could eavesdrop on another frequency by will alone. The distance marker on the wall ahead read 1.5 miles. He had already passed that. He frowned, turned his head the barest fraction to confirm. The sign slid by his window at the exact same angle, same height, same style. It could have been a second, identical marker placed for redundancy. He'd driven enough tunnels to know they sometimes did that. But something in the way the number hit his eyes, familiar, exact, made his stomach tighten slightly. He watched the next segment of wall with more focus. Tiles. Emergency phones recessed into shallow alcoves at intervals. Red boxes with handsets behind clear doors. Another sign. Emergency Bay 0.5 miles. The advisory on 5:30 a.m. repeated its loop. Over it, for the briefest instant, he thought he heard another voice, almost under the announcer's. Don't stop in the lane. It was there and gone too quickly, too. Parse. He flexed his shoulders, tried to shake off the creeping feeling that the tunnel had stretched in some small but meaningful way. His headlights picked out another bay sign. Emergency Bay 0.5 miles. It might have been a series. It might have been the same sign. Up ahead, the car's taillights brightened more than before, then dimmed. A little jittery tap-tap on the brakes. The fog around it swirled as if something had disturbed it from another direction. Jonah checked his own speed again, 42. He eased off the pedal slightly, dropping a mile or two. Better too slow than too fast in a place like this. As his truck rolled on, the tunnel's air seemed to grow heavier, dampness thickening. The subtle scent of exhaust from countless vehicles accumulated over time mingled with a cooler, almost mineral smell of wet rock. The windows, despite the heater's efforts, edged with a faint film of moisture. He flipped his defrost setting. The fan in the dash whirred louder, pushing dry air across the glass, smearing the dampness into a temporary clarity. In that brief patch of clarity, as his gaze slid along the driver's side glass toward the mirror, he saw, reflected in the curve of his own window, another set of headlights. They were not perfectly aligned with his. They hung slightly offset, as if a second truck ran just behind and to his left in a parallel corridor. The beams were a different hue, a warmer yellow, softer. He instinctively glanced at the driver's side mirror. The glass outside the cab showed only the blank tiled wall, the rhythmic march of emergency phones, the occasional sign. No vehicle, no lights, just the pattern of the tunnel. In the interior reflection, though, those headlights hovered, small but steady, following his motion. He blinked, looked back. For a moment they were gone. Then, as his eyes adjusted again to the interplay of shadow and fluorescent glare, he caught them once more. Not bright enough to be a real truck crowding him, just present enough to be undeniable. He listened. The CB stayed quiet. The radio advisory loops continued. The fan overhead hummed. Somewhere deep in the concrete around him, water dripped in a slow, patient rhythm, almost too soft to hear over the engine. Another distance marker appeared, 1.5 miles. His knuckles tightened on the wheel. The car ahead changed. Its taillights, which had been a small, consistent pair of dots in the white, suddenly swerved a fraction to the left, then corrected. The glow bobbed, rose, then snapped back to its lane center as if a set of hands had jerked on the wheel and then forced it back. Jonah's own hands twitched in sympathetic echo. He dropped his speed to 35, feeling the rig settle just a touch more solidly into the road, the engine brake taking on more of the load. As he rolled past another emergency phone alcove, he saw, in the tiled recess beyond it, a shape that should not have been there. It was the suggestion of a truck cab, visible only in the curved reflection of light off the glossy tiles, a pale smudge of chrome where no chrome existed, as if the wall itself momentarily remembered a vehicle that had once pressed too close. In that smear of almost image, he thought he could make out a figure in a high-vis vest standing by the front fender, one hand resting on the open door, head bowed as if listening to something only he could hear inside. Then the angle changed, the tiles slid by, and the reflection dissolved into nothing but light and grout. He felt the prickle along his shoulders intensify, but it did not crest into panic. There was under it a different note, one that felt oddly like concern, not his own, someone else's, directed, focused. The CB came alive again, unbidden. This time the voice was clearer, closer, though still riding on a bed of static that spoke of concrete and distance. Southbound unit, flatbed with the blue tarp, you're runnin' light on your binders. The accent was local mountain, vowels rounded by years. Check your rear chains, driver. They're singin' more than they ought to. Jonah's heartbeat thudded, flatbed, blue tarp. He checked his mirror, not for phantom headlights this time, but for the faint, barely noticeable flutter at the back of his rig. He'd been blamming on crosswinds that weren't there. The tarp did seem to be breathing more than it should, a subtle, rhythmic swell and dip, as if one of the corner fastenings wasn't as firm as it had been. He thumbed the mic. "Copy that," he said, voice a half-tone rougher. "This is southbound in Long Night, loaded flat with blue cover. You got eyes on me somewhere. I'm not seeing anybody back there." A soft chuckle came through, the sound turned strange by the echo, not mocking but rueful. "Got enough eyes where I am," the voice replied. "More than I'd like some nights. You're common up on the center bay now. That's your only safe hold till daylight. Pull in, driver. You'll want to be square before you point her down the hill." Jonah glanced ahead. He'd been in the tunnel long enough that the idea of center felt more conceptual than measurable. But as the voice spoke, his headlights picked up a widening in the right-hand wall, an opening deeper than the emergency phone cutouts, marked by a sign overhead. "Emergency bay, pull off in case of disablement, 200 FT. He'd never noticed a bay exactly here before. But then, he'd never driven the tunnel at night, with fog, and his attention stretched over so many strange little details. The advisory on 5:30 a.m. said no stopping except in bays. The voice on the CB, wherever it came from, insisted he use this one. His own creeping sense that something at the back of his trailer wasn't quite as secure as he liked added its vote. He flipped on his right indicator, the soft tick-tick leaking faintly into the enclosed space. The bay materialized out of the fog, a slightly recessed area widened enough for a truck to pull mostly out of the traffic lane, its floor painted with diagonal white stripes, its far wall bearing a bank of fire extinguishers and emergency telephones behind glass. The light there was a touch brighter, more concentrated. He eased the rig toward it, tires thumping gently over a seam in the concrete. The truck settled into the space with inches to spare, its bulk filling the alcove. The car that had been leading him carried on, its tail lights shrinking ahead, then dipping as the tunnel curved. When he set the brake, the sudden stillness rang almost as loudly as the earlier hum. The engine idled then, at his hand's twist, died, leaving only the fan overhead and the far-off rush of unseen ventilation. For a long moment he just sat, hands resting on his thighs, feeling his own pulse in his fingertips. Fog drifted in slow curls at the edges of his beams. The tunnel ahead and behind was an empty, glowing throat. He opened the door. The air that met him was cool and damp, tasting faintly of concrete dust and old exhaust. It carried a metallic note, a ghost of brake pads heated and cooled over decades. Sound behaved oddly. Every movement of his boots on the concrete floor rang back to him with a slight lag, a soft slap echo. He walked along the side of his trailer, flashlight in hand. The beam cut sharp through the thin ground fog, painting the side of the blue tarp in silvery highlights. At the rear, near the second-to-last crossbar, he found it, a chain, its hook not properly seated in the eyelet. It had held so far by friction and angle, but vibration had worked it loose enough that one good hit from a pothole might have knocked it free altogether. The load beneath, metal shelving strapped tight but heavy, would have shifted. "All right," he murmured, "you were right." He didn't say it to the chain, or to himself. He repositioned the hook, listening to the tiny metallic scrape it made as it slid into place. The sound seemed to travel farther than it should, echoing down the tunnel's length, as if carried by unseen channels. Somewhere behind him, at the edge of hearing, a voice spoke, not through the CB this time, just there. "Always one that wants to sing," it said quietly, "every time." Jonah straightened slowly. The hair on his arms rose under his jacket. He turned. At the far end of the bay, just beyond the bright pool cast by the overhead fixture, a man stood. He wore a reflective vest over a dark jacket, the silver stripes catching what light they could and sending it back in understated flashes. A hard hat sat low on his head, shadowing his face. His posture was relaxed but alert, hands resting lightly on his hips, as if he'd been standing there for a while, just watching. For a moment, Jonah thought he was one of the tunnel maintenance crew, someone who'd been making rounds and had slipped into the bay unnoticed. The logical part of his mind seized on that explanation like a lifeline. Then he noticed the details that didn't fit. The vest's fabric was an older style, bulkier, with thicker reflective bands yellowed at the edges. The hard hat's shape was different from the modern ones he saw at sites now, rounder, with a distinctive ridge. The boots, barely visible below the hem of the man's work pants, were leather with scuffed toes and a cut he associated with the late 80s. And across the chest of the vest, in faded black letters, a name had been stenciled once. The letters were worn, some almost completely gone, but he could make out enough. H. Dahl, SCP. H. Dahl something, the last letters obscured by a smear. Neil's breath left him in a thin, controlled stream. "Appreciate the tip," he said, because it felt more natural than silence. The man's head inclined a fraction. In the curving reflection from the tile, Jonah caught a suggestion of a lined face, eyes pale and thoughtful, not unkind, not particularly surprised to be spoken to. "Some loads talk louder than others," the man said. His voice was the same one Jonah had heard over the CB, local flavored, quiet. "Long night likes to make 'em louder if you let it. Gives you just enough room to hear things you'd rather ignore." Jonah swallowed. His mouth felt oddly dry despite the damp air. "You work the tunnel?" he asked. "Maintenance." A ghost of a smile touched the man's mouth. "Did," he said, "for a time." He stepped a little closer, still careful to remain just at the edge of full light. The reflective bands on his vest caught Jonah's headlights and the overhead fixture, combining their glow into soft, indistinct glimmers. "Lot of nights in here," the man added. "Lot of fog drifting in off the mouths, hanging where it shouldn't. Lot of drivers pushing past what their brakes and eyes could really do. You see enough of that, you either move on or you start sticking around." He said it simply, like a statement of weather. Jonah's hand itched to reach for his phone, as if taking a picture would somehow pin this down, make it less ephemeral. He didn't move. Somehow he sensed that trying to freeze any of this would be like cupping fog in his palms. "You still run the board?" Jonah asked, glancing reflexively toward where the tunnel's control room would be, somewhere above and ahead, behind layers of concrete and steel. "Ah, they've got computers for that now," the man said, faint amusement in his voice. "Sensors and cameras. Folks up top watching screens. I'm more of a local advisory these days." His gaze drifted past Jonah, down the tunnel's dim curve. "You're not the only one turned around in here tonight, but you're the only one who answered when I called your unit." Jonah thought of the garbled voice he'd first heard on the CB, talking about brake smoke and stacks of trucks. "That from tonight?" he asked. "Or another night?" The man's smile thinned. "Depends what you mean by tonight," he said. "Time gets a little stretched in these long concrete throats. Accidents leave dents in more than the walls. Some of them take longer to buff out than folks like to admit." He glanced at the chain Jonah had just corrected. His expression turned briefly softer, almost proud, like that of a teacher seeing a student finally apply a long-ago lesson. "You're good to roll," he said. "Take it easy on the descent. Fog's thicker on the far side. A lot of folks forget that." Jonah nodded. "I won't forget," he said quietly. The man, H. Dahl, whatever his full name, had been tipped an invisible brim. "That's what they all say," he replied. "Some mean it more than others." A horn echoed distantly through the tunnel, the sound warped by the concrete. Somewhere far ahead, a trucker announced his presence with a quick blast, then the noise faded into the ambient hum. Jonah glanced that way, then back to the bay. It was empty. No man, no vest. Just the painted diagonal lines on the floor, the bank of emergency gear, the fog rolling in thin layers near the ceiling. He stood there for a full 3 slow breaths, flashlight beam trembling just slightly on the concrete at his feet. In the quiet, the advisory on 5:30 a.m. ticked over to a slightly different script without him noticing at first. Long night tunnel maintenance reminder. In memory of Henry Dalrymple, tunnel safety officer, 1969-1992. Drive safely. Observe posted limits. Arrive alive. The name snagged in his awareness. Dalrymple. H-D-A-L-R-Y-M-P-L-E. The worn letters on the vest filled themselves in his mind. He climbed back into the cab, hands moving through familiar motions. Key, engine, gauges live, belt, mirrors, the ritual grounded him. The cab, cramped and plain and full of his own accumulated clutter, felt suddenly very precious. He signaled, waited until the faint glow of another vehicle passed in the main tunnel lane, then eased his rig back out, nose first, careful and patient. As the bay receded in his mirrors, the fog inside Long Night closed around him again in its luminous embrace. The tiled walls marched on, the fans hummed. Distance markers, 1, 75, 2 slid by, their numbers finally advancing the way they should. He listened. The CB was quiet now, but the silence no longer felt indifferent. It felt occupied, as if someone were out there somewhere in the infrastructure, watching his tail lights with measured interest. The tunnel curved gently to the right. Way ahead, the darkness at its end began to pale, a small hint of whatever passed for night on the far side. The fog thickened again in low banks as cooler air from the outside pressed inward. As he rolled toward that lighter patch, Jonah glanced into his left mirror one last time. In the curve of the glass, under the smear of his own rig's reflection, he saw, for an instant, another truck moving along beside him in the ghost corridor that existed only in edges and echoes. It was an older model, boxier, its paint indeterminate in the washed-out light. In its cab, a figure in a hard hat and vest sat with one hand on the wheel, the other on a microphone, eyes fixed ahead. Then the angle shifted, light changed, and there was only the blank tunnel wall and his own trailer stretching out behind. He emerged from Long Night Tunnel into a world mottled with fog and mountain darkness. The air outside was colder than the tunnel, fresher in a way that carried pine and damp earth. His headlights reached farther here, though still limited by drifting white patches that hugged the downhill grade. The descent demanded respect. He gave it. He kept his speed modest, gears low, engine brakes singing its familiar song. The fog on this side was indeed thicker in places, pooling in the hollows of the mountain road. But he was ready for it now, eyes scanning for the subtle cues, the reflectors, the guardrail brakes, that told the story of the grade even when visibility failed. Halfway down, the CB crackled alive with two local drivers joking about Long Night's ghost inspector, catching another careless rookie. Their laughter was easy, edged with the kind of superstition that didn't quite commit to belief, but didn't dismiss it either. Jonah said nothing. He just listened, a slight curve to his mouth. On clear days and other nights, in other tunnels and other passes, the memory of that bay, a wedge of bright concrete hung inside wet, humming darkness, stayed with him. So did the knowledge that somewhere in the bones of that mountain, a man who had once walked the tunnel night after night might still be doing rounds of a sort, listening for chains that sang wrong and tires that whispered danger. The next time he approached Long Night and the advisory on 5:30 a.m. called out its dry warnings, Jonah tuned in with a different kind of attention. If he heard, under the script, the faintest trace of another voice saying, "Take it easy, driver," he would not, could not, say that it wasn't there. And in the fog, when distance markers played their quiet games and reflections hinted at more than they showed, he found a strange comfort in imagining that some places in the infrastructure of the world simply refused to forget those who had watched over them, that they held on, in their own concrete, tiled, humming way, to the vigilance of old hands who had seen enough bad nights to want better ones for those still rolling through. Story number 7. The prairie at night was supposed to be simple. A straight road, a wide sky, and nothing but the slow pulse of mile markers slipping by under a great dark bowl of stars. But on this stretch of Highway 77, where the land rose just enough to break the wind and the low swales held air like water, the fog liked to collect and stay, turning simplicity into something else. Cass's truck moved through it like a steady, rumbling ship cutting across a calm, white sea. Her rig, a long-nosed blue Kenworth with a silver stripe and a few stickers tucked along the bottom of the driver's door, held a low, confident tone as it rolled north. The trailer behind her was sealed and anonymous, a refrigerated box humming quietly, its freight as unremarkable as frozen vegetables could be. Inside the cab, the world was reduced to intimate dimensions. The soft glow of the instrument cluster, the faint warmth from the vents on her hands, the smell of coffee gone a little stale in the travel mug. The clock in the dash read 2:19 a.m. She left the last lit town an hour ago. A scattering of sodium lamps along a short main drag, a closed diner with a hand-lettered "See you at 6 a.m." sign, the faint halo of a 24-hour gas station. Beyond that, the world had fallen away into dark fields and low, rolling ground. The radio played low, some late-night disc jockey talking about nothing much in between songs, his voice softened by distance and the analog fuzz of a station half a state away. The fog had started as a few wisps over a drainage ditch, then thickened in the low spots, then risen until it filled everything from ankle height to the unseen stars. Cass's headlights created two bright tunnels, the beams cutting cleanly for a few truck lengths and then diffusing into a luminous wall. The road lines, white on either side, broken yellow in the center, shone back at her with predictable rhythm, the paint's tiny glass beads catching and throwing her light. She wasn't tired enough yet for it to be dangerous. The day had been long, but she'd taken her breaks when she should, napped when the hours demanded it. Still, the monotony of white and gray pressed at the edges of her concentration in a way clear night never did. The sense of distance was gone. The landscape could have been anything beyond that glowing curtain: mountains, ocean, empty air. Her hands held the wheel at 10 and 2 without conscious thought. The engine's hum, the steady hiss of tires on asphalt, the small, familiar vibration under her boots, all of it worked together into a kind of moving cradle. It was comforting, and that, she knew, was its own kind of risk. The CB radio sat quiet on its bracket, volume turned low. She hadn't heard much chatter in the last stretch, just a couple of voices earlier talking about a cattle truck sighting in at a feedlot exit, then nothing. Out here, on this particular run, Highway 77 could feel like it belonged to whichever driver happened to be on it at the time. She glanced at the GPS display, more from habit than need. The little blue arrow representing her truck slid along a perfectly straight line. 10 miles to the next exit, just a county road that crossed under and headed off into dark farmland. 65 miles to the next town with a truck stop she liked. The screen's colors looked oddly intense against the soft monotones outside, an electronic certainty overlaying a world reduced to suggestion. A green mile marker appeared briefly on the right, its number lighting up in the beams, 206, and was gone. Cass took a sip of coffee, more for something to do than for the caffeine. It had cooled to a tepid bitterness, but the ritual comforted her. The cab smelled of that, and the faint trace of the citrus cleaner she'd wiped down the dash with weeks ago. In the mirror, there was almost nothing. The red glow of her own trailer lights, blurred and small in the fog, and beyond them, white. She was alone. She told herself so, and mostly believed it, until the second set of headlights appeared. They arrived first as a subtle brightening in the mirror's lower left corner, a faint, double glow far behind her, barely punching through the dense air. Over a minute or so, those pinpricks grew, resolving into the familiar spacing of a large vehicle, high enough to be a truck, close enough to be on her stretch of highway, not some far-off farm road. She watched them with half an eye, the way a driver does when someone settles in behind at a great distance. The other rig was far back enough not to be crowding. Its lights held their place, neither gaining on her quickly nor falling away. A sensible driver, then, matching her pace. She didn't mind the company, in theory. There was something comforting about knowing that somewhere behind, Another human was moving through the same narrow band of white. Even if she never heard their voice, even if they never passed, the fact of their presence made the road feel less like an empty stage. Mile 207 slid by. The fog deepened, if such a thing were possible. Her headlights picked out faint moisture on the asphalt, darkening the surface slightly. No rain, just condensed air. The other truck's headlights adjusted too, keeping perfect relative distance. When she eased off the accelerator a fraction on a barely perceptible rise, the glow in the mirror dimmed at the same rate. When she pressed down again, it brightened in sync. They held that invisible tether between them for 5-10 minutes. Time blurred. Fog didn't lend itself to precise accounting. At some point, idly, she flicked her eyes from the road ahead to the driver's side mirror and back. For half a heartbeat, in the moment when her gaze crossed the smear of interior reflection in the glass, she thought she saw not just the lights behind, but the faint suggestion of a blue hood like her own. Same contour, same set of roof markers. Her mind dismissed it as geometry, the overlap of her own beams and the mirror's angle, a trick of light. She'd been staring into whiteness long enough for her brain to start layering familiar patterns into it. The CB crackled once, a sharp pop of static, then fell silent again. Ahead, the dull silhouette of an overpass materialized in pieces. First the upward slant of the embankment, then the black gap of space under concrete, then the dark line of the bridge itself. Fog clung to its underside, drifting lazily as she passed beneath. Her headlights splashed briefly off the damp concrete, turning it into a low, flat mirror. In that instant, she saw a blue truck reflected there, as if on the ceiling, her own nose down, ghosting above her position in perfect alignment. Only, for a fraction of a second, there were two. One solid, the other offset by half a width, overlapping like a double exposure. She blinked. The bridge was gone, the road leveled out, the reflection dissolved back into memory. Get a grip, she told herself, not unkindly. Fog plays with your depth, that's all. The highway whispered under her tires. The landscape on either side remained resolutely hidden. The mile markers did their quiet procession, 208, 209. The headlights behind her neither closed nor fell away. The first odd thing happened at mile 210. Her GPS chimed, a small, polite tone it used for upcoming intersections. The screen displayed an exit half a mile ahead, County 14. Unremarkable, a narrow road that crossed the prairie east-west, barely used at this hour. At the same moment, the radio, tuned low, shifted abruptly into static for half a bar of music, then returned with the same song, a verse behind. The DJ's voice cut in briefly, his words oddly blurred. Just east of the old loop, drivers reporting heavy fog. Yes, again. Take it slow out there on Mirror Mile. Mirror Mile. The phrase landed with a soft, definite weight in Cass's mind. She'd heard it before. Over coffee at a Midwest truck stop, an older woman had mentioned it in passing while pointing out weird stretches on an atlas map. There's that mile or two on 77 locals called the Mirror, she'd said. Fog loves it. People swear they see their own rigs out there running alongside. Good for keeping you honest. Bad for folks already spooked. Cass hadn't thought much of it then. A story, another road myth to add to the collection. Now, as the exit sign for County 14 emerged from the fog and slid past her window, the word mirror felt less like folklore and more like a gentle, private warning. She checked the rearview again. The same twin orbs of light floated steadfastly in place, calm as distant stars. A faint, strange sound threaded into the cab, so soft she almost missed it under the engine. It was like her own voice humming, caught on the edge of hearing. She shifted her attention, listening. The noise fluttered once, twice, then was gone, leaving only the normal mechanical chorus. She drove on. The road here had a slight, almost imperceptible tilt to the right, a curve so gentle it was more theoretical than tactile. Cass's hands made the adjustment automatically, keeping the truck centered. Another overpass approached, another dark shape looming out of white. As she went under, her beams fanning across the concrete above, she looked up without quite meaning to. The reflection in the dipped underbelly of the bridge showed a dizzying flash, the underside of her own trailer, the smeared glow of lights, and for a blink that stretched, a second truck running parallel just a lane width over. Same blue, same silver side stripe, same slight dent on the forward edge of the bumper. Her stomach dropped, not in fear but in that strange, weightless way you get when you see yourself in a place you didn't expect to, a shop window, a passing car. Then the ceiling fled behind her, and the road reclaimed her attention. The CB, long silent, gave a soft, almost apologetic hiss. A single word slipped through, wrapped in static. Easy, it said, or seemed to. It might have been a fragment of some longer transmission, half heard, half imagined. She reached for the mic, thumb hovering over the talk button, then let it fall back. She had nothing to say that wouldn't make her feel more self-conscious to have aired. The headlights behind her dimmed slightly, as if the driver had increased following distance. In the ever-present fog, that was nothing more than a change in intensity, but she read it in the way a person reads another's body language. Ahead, the vague red smudge of taillights appeared out of nowhere, closer than she liked. She reacted before full thought, pressure on the brake, heart kicking hard. The car, or truck, lurched in her perception, a shape occupying her lane at a distance that made her muscles seize. Its brake lights blazed, touching the fog with bright, blood-like color. She had a flash impression of a small sedan crooked across the road, hazard lights silent but flashing, its presence as solid as anything else in the white world. Her own rig slowed, engine brake biting softly, trailer pressing forward with manageable insistence. Then the hazard-limbed shape was gone. One heartbeat, there was something. The next, there was nothing but fog and empty asphalt and the march of lane lines, undisturbed. Cass swallowed. Her hands tingled with the aftermath of adrenaline. She scanned the mirrors, the shoulders, the road ahead again, searching for any trace of what she'd reacted to. A set of skid marks, a gleam of glass. There was nothing. Behind her, the twin headlights maintained their ghost distance, having slowed along with her. She edged her foot back to the accelerator, bringing the truck back up to speed gingerly. Her pulse took longer to settle. Fog throws shapes, she told herself under her breath. You know that. Light shadow your own beams on the mist, that's all. But the way her body had recognized something, had braced before her mind named it, lingered. 5 miles later, it happened again. This time it wasn't a car. It was the outline of a semi at the far edge of her lights, angled across the median as if it had ridden right up and over. The impression lasted less than a second. A high, boxy shadow, red lights burning where they shouldn't, a flash of rain-slick reflective tape. She eased off the throttle automatically, eyes scanning for a continuation of that shape, for any mass that would justify her instinct. There was only white. She breathed out long and controlled. The engine idled on, unbothered. The GPS cheerfully informed her that she was approaching the midpoint of a segment locals simply labeled County Line on paper maps. Out here, that meant not much more than another sign buried somewhere in the fog, but in driver stories, it was the vague point where the mirror mile began and ended, depending on who you asked. The other truck, if truck it was, remained behind her at that same, oddly courteous distance. So well-tuned was its following that she found herself imagining the unknown driver's hands on their wheel, mimicking her pressures, her small corrections. She thought of her reflection in the overpass ceiling, of the identical dent on the bumper, of the curve of color she knew so well on her own hood, echoed in that dizzying, upside-down flash. An idea rose in her mind that was absurd on its face, and yet settled into place like a puzzle piece. That whoever was out there behind her, packing her so perfectly, was not just another driver with good habits, but some other version of herself. A truck shaped like hers, worn in the same places, moving along some offset lane just a hair to the left of the one she knew. She didn't believe it, not really, but the thought refused to fully leave. On the radio, the DJ chose that moment to back announce a song about second chances. "Coming up on the 2 a.m. hour," he said, voice smoothing through the static. "Fog advisories all up and down 77 tonight. Mirrors can be tricky things. They show you what's there and what could have been. Leave a little extra room for the road and for yourself." She almost laughed. Almost. It came out as a breath with the shape of humor, but not the sound. The highway dipped gently, then rose. The fog thinned for a handful of heartbeats, enough for her to see the dim outline of a windbreak, a line of bare trees reaching up like fingers. Their trunks were black strokes against a slightly less black background. In that clearing, for the first time, she saw the truck behind her clearly enough to make out more than its lights. It was, as she'd half suspected, blue with a silver stripe. Roof markers in the same arrangement as hers. A company logo in the same place on the door. Even at that distance, even in that light, she could see the specific pattern of paint chips on the edge of the hood, a scatter she'd memorized without meaning to in parking lots and reflected storefronts. Her chest tightened. Her own truck's number was painted on her hood just below the windshield, 1842. The numbers had a certain stroke to them, a way the stencil had skipped slightly on the 8, leaving a tiny gap. On the machine behind her, for a fraction of a second as the fog lifted, she saw the same numerals. Not similar, the same. Then the white closed in again, erasing everything but the glow of lights. The CB popped. A voice slid through, quiet, familiar in a way that made her scalp tingle. "Cass," it said, just her name. The way she said it at way stations, the way dispatch said it when assigning loads. No handle, no call sign, just Cass. Her throat went dry. She snatched up the mic almost without thinking. "Yeah," she said, and heard the thin tremor in her own answer. Static hissed softly, as if something on the other end had let out a breath. 3 miles, the voice said. "Schoolhouse bends slick tonight, you know that, don't pretend you don't." Then nothing but the tunnel hum of the engine, and the low, constant rush of tires. Schoolhouse Bend, an innocuous name for a curve on a highway most out-of-staters would have considered barely a deviation. Locals had a way of nomming things. That old, slightly tighter turn by the abandoned red brick schoolhouse had earned its moniker through years of winter spins and summer overcorrections. Cass had nearly lost a trailer there once, early in her career, when black ice had turned the shading of pavement into a thin, treacherous glaze. She'd hit the curve too fast for the conditions, felt the weight behind her start to push, to want to slide outward. She learned more in that 50-yard stretch than in any classroom. Tonight, with visibility shrunk to a gray tube and the dew settling heavily on everything, it made sense that the familiar bad spot would be worse. She checked her odometer against the mental map that lived under her skin. 3 miles. Yes, that was about right. Her foot lifted from the throttle. She let the truck drift down 5 miles per hour, then 10. The engine brake's song changed pitch, a lower, more controlled note. The other truck's headlights responded in kind, not hurrying her. The fog grew denser, if that were possible. Light bounced back at her in a shorter and shorter band. Shadows of nothing rode the edges of her vision. A shape separated itself from that formlessness on the right as she approached the general area where the red brick schoolhouse would be, though she couldn't see it. It was just darker, a bulk that spoke of a structure, watching the road. Then the road itself curved, modestly but with intent. As her front wheels began the turn, her beams slid across damp asphalt and caught something on the far shoulder. Faint twin tracks, darker streaks on the surface where tires had slid, then straightened. They were fresh enough that the moisture's sheen had not yet fully returned. Her hands tightened on the wheel, not to jerk, but to hold gently firm. She kept her speed low, let the rig follow the curve as if walking it on a leash. In her left mirror, for an instant that stretched long, the reflection showed not just her own trailer lights, but the blue nose of another truck closer than it should have been, its wheels angled slightly off true, as if it were in the act of correcting a minor slide. Its cab leaned in the curve with a degree of tilt she recognized from that night years ago when she'd fought the same physics. Her trailer rode the bend without complaint. The gentle outward tug, the potential energy in the weight, stayed leashed. On the CB, faintly, the same voice exhaled, "There you go, still with me." She drove into the heart of the curve and out the other side. The geometry straightened. The schoolhouse sank back into fog. The dark suggestion of its outline faded. Behind her, the twin lights held their patient station. "Who are you?" she asked, not into the mic but into the cabin itself. The word hung there, small and swallowed. The radio, as if answering in metaphor, played a song about roads not taken. Her own truck, solid and real and full of humming machinery, needed her attention. She gave it that, though part of her awareness now occupied the odd, parallel track running a few truck lengths behind and fractionally to the left. The idea of another rig, another Cass, making slightly different decisions under nearly identical conditions. The highway began a slow, almost unnoticeable descent toward the river flats. The fog responded, thicker again, colder, pooling where the temperature nudged down a degree. The GPS trilled. Ahead, the route line bent around a small icon that marked a crossroads. She didn't need the screen to know what it was. The route notes from dispatch had mentioned a detour for construction ahead, offering an alternate path for trucks over a temporary bypass. In her memory, another version of Highway 77 cut straight through the intersection, over an old iron bridge that had been deemed too narrow and too old for the heaviest modern loads. She'd run that way once years ago, before the detour had become permanent. The bridge had creaked as if it resented her weight. She'd heard in the easy rumor of truck stop talk that more than one rig had gone sideways on that curve leading onto it in bad weather. No gore in the telling, just a kind of resigned shake of the head. Tonight's plan, the one printed on her dispatch sheet, had her taking the new bypass, a slightly longer curve to the right, then a modern concrete span across the dark suggestion of the river, all smoothed and gentled for safety. The fog did its best to make both routes look equally vague. Two directions of glowing white, signs thrust up from the nothingness with arrows and instructions that arrived only when she was nearly on top of them. As she approached, her headlights picked out the big green overhead, 77 North Bypass. To its left, smaller and dimmer, a weathered sign with black letters on white, Old Bridge Road, weight limit 20 tons. Her rig, fully loaded, far exceeded that. The GPS arrow, consulted more out of habit than need, aimed cheerfully down the bypass path. In the reflection of the overhead sign's glassy surface, for a moment she saw two trucks, hers angling right toward the safer route, and another, almost perfectly overlaid, nosing left, toward the narrow ribbon where the old steel truss sat somewhere in the darkness. That second truck's outline juddered, then froze, nose lifted slightly as if caught mid-brake, mid-decision. Headlights, hers or not, flared against fog and old paint. Her hands, already in the act of turning, finished the movement firmly to the right, tires following the modern curve. The engine responded with that subtle shift in centrifugal pressure. Traction held. Concrete sang under her wheels. In the corner of her eye, as she passed the fork, something darker than fog seemed to gather on the left-hand path. A sense, rather than a sight, of abrupt, misjudged angle, of weight pushing where it wasn't meant to go. She did not look directly. She did not have to. On the CB, the ghost of her own voice, or someone like her, said softly, "Good. That one was mine to learn. No sense in you doing it twice." She drove out onto the new bridge. The fog over the river was thicker but differently flavored, a wet cold enhanced by the unseen water moving beneath. Her headlights shortened further, their cones swallowed more quickly. The railing on either side appeared in staccato bursts. Metal, fog, metal, fog. The other rig's lights behind her did not follow onto the bridge. For the first time since she'd noticed it, the glow in the mirror faded, weakening with each second, until the white behind her was empty again. Cass felt the absence like a slight loosening in her chest, a thread that had been taut now gently slackening. She crossed the river. The bridge rose and fell. The hum of the tires changed pitch over the expansion joints, a rhythm she rode out without thinking. On the far side, the road rejoined the original alignment. The fog began, slowly, incrementally, to thin. The white narrowed to streaks along the ditch lines, then to patches over low-lying fields, then to a light mist that clung around streams and shelter belts. The sky above, previously a void, cracked open in places to reveal a deeper dimensionality of darkness and a few scattered stars. Her mirrors showed only her own trailer lights, and beyond them, the faint suggestion of an actual horizon. The CB stayed quiet. The tunnel feel of the cab eased into something more expansive. By the time the next town's glow colored the undersides of the remaining clouds, a soft, warming amber on the horizon, Cass felt almost foolish for how deeply the fog had gotten under her skin. Almost. At the truck stop, under the bright, buzzing wash of fluorescent and LED, the night's strangeness seemed to recede. The lot was half full of sleeping rigs, their cab curtains drawn, their engines ticking as they cooled. The smell of hot oil, diesel, and fryer grease mingled in the chill air. She parked at the far edge, backed into a slot with a line of concrete blocks behind, and set the brake. The silence inside the cab after the engine shut down ringed in her ears. For a moment she sat there, looking at her own hands on her knees, at the smudge of bug on the windshield, at the dangling fabric rabbit one of her nieces had insisted she hang from the visor years ago. Then she reached up and almost shyly flipped the CB back on to a comfortable volume. Static greeted her, with occasional crackles of distant conversations. "You runnin' through the mirror tonight?" someone's voice asked, somewhere out on the highway. "Fog thick as soup. Saw my own tail lights once, swear to God." Another driver chuckled. "You keep your eyes open and your ego light mirror mile'll treat you right," he said. "Close your eyes or get too full of yourself. It'll show you what you're missing." Cass listened to them, anonymous and unknowing. Out the side window, through thin, civilized yard fog, she could see her own truck reflected in the glass of the diner's window. Blue, silver, solid. Only one of it. Still, as she slid into the bunk later, pulling the heavy curtain almost all the way shut, she left a small gap. Through it, she could see the faint outline of her steering wheel, her dash, the CB mic on its hook. She thought about echoes, not just of sound, but of decisions. Of all the tiny choices a driver makes in 1,000-mile stretches, 5 miles faster or slower, this lane or that, this exit or the next. How a handful of such choices could, on a bad night, be the difference between a near miss and a story no one wanted to tell in detail. If there was, somewhere out there in the layered white of fog and past and present, another version of her still working through the bad nights she'd already had, she hoped that Cass, not this one but that one, had someone or something watching her back as well. On Highway 77, in the low places where the fog rolled in thick and refused to leave, local drivers still talked about the Mirror Mile. Some said they'd seen their own company logos hovering in the mist beside them, or watched their future mistakes play out a truck length away, bought time to correct them. Others dismissed it all as weather and imagination. But every now and then, on nights when the white swallowed everything, and the only real things in the world were the paint beneath the wheels and the glow of the dash, there would be a driver who eased off the accelerator a little before a familiar bad curve, or chose the newer bridge over the old one, or double-checked a chain because a voice like their own had told them to. And if they happened, in a reflective overpass ceiling, to glimpse a blue truck almost exactly like theirs running just beside or behind, they might not mention it on the radio. They might keep it instead as a small, private mystery, a reminder that on some stretches of road, even your own shadow might want to see you safely through the fog.